stream Q&A, Ask Me Anything, where you can ask me, a historian, anything you would like about history or social studies. So the topic is, as always, history, and we are making up for lost time yesterday, where we weren't able to do a live stream because I was on the road. So that means the good news about all of that is you get to go 2 hours with Friendly Neighborhood History, asking whatever questions you would like about history and social sciences. Tomorrow we have our live stream lecture on a topic that you can vote about here on the Friendly Neighborhood History channel here on YouTube. So please watch out for that poll and please vote for the topic you would like me to discuss tomorrow. So really good to have you all here. Hope you're enjoying your weekend. Thank you for choosing to spend some of it with us here at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. Yeah, I will be with you for the next 2 hours, so till about 5:30 or so. We do this every Friday and Saturday. Fridays at 6, Saturdays at 3, and then Sundays at 4 p.m. Eastern is the live stream lecture, and we're making up for yesterday. So going to find a nice historical background here. We'll use this one. This one's a friendly one. It's a Roman forum in the city of Rome. And yes, Rodolfo, you were first. Great to have you here. My moderators will be holding down the chat. And yeah, so let's get started. If you have a question about history or social sciences, please drop it in the chat. And consider liking and subscribing, becoming a Friendly Neighborhood Historian. That's absolutely free. If you want to become a member or give a super chat to help the channel out, that would be very much appreciated, but no pressure whatsoever. A very happy weekend to you. And again, we appreciate you choosing to spend some of it with us here at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. So anyways, drop a topic, comment, or question in the chat, and I will be sure to answer it in a friendly, neighborly manner. As we are just over 2 years old, we celebrated our second birthday last weekend with a bunch of extra live streams and bonus content that you can check out. Both short and long form and live streams are all available for members and non-members alike, although there are bonus contents that are available for members, as well as emojis and members' lives. So yeah, hope you're all having a great day. And again, welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. And as soon as we start getting comments, questions, and topics in the chat, we will start discussing them with you. So please don't be shy, don't be hesitant. And as I suspected, I was right all along. Pull up something to somewhere to sit and pull up something enjoyable to drink and get started for 2 great hours of what I think will be really, really fun and very enjoyable Friendly Neighborhood History. How's the 1812 debate coming along? It's not. I mean, I haven't heard anything because the two people who are supposed to debate it don't want to debate each other. So if we could actually get some consensus on both of them debating, then we could actually get our debate about the War of 1812. Basically, one of my moderators, a Brit named Harry, is very, very pro-British, quite the Anglophile, and really an apologist for the British Empire in many of its facets. And one of my other moderators, Horace, is a big American historian, and I mean, I'm a historian of both fields, and I have a particular opinion about the War of 1812, but Horace has basically made it his campaign to try to prove to everybody that the United States did not lose the War of 1812, which it clearly did, but Harry is willing to debate him, so it's really an Anglophile versus an Amerophile, debating about American history and British history coming together during that war, which is a war we don't talk about enough. So it's a really interesting niche topic that's very popular here on the channel, and I've kind of gotten sick and tired of discussing it. I've done a live stream lecture on it, I've done videos on it, I've gone into intense detail. I probably should do a long-form video on the War of 1812 at some point, but I've gone into a lot of detail about this thing, and I think it's pretty petty the way we just insist about it. But I was supposed to moderate a debate with them using Discord and then put that here on YouTube. So once we can actually get a consensus about what that would look like, and when it could take place, then we can do it. Maybe we'll do it sometime in March. Hello, Chris. Welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. Could you discuss the Scottish-Irish and the origins? So the Scots-Irish, so Scotland at several times during Irish history actually settled different parts of Ireland and tried to basically create colonies and settlements there, especially during the Tudor and Stuart period when Scotland and England became more interconnected. Of course, once it becomes Great Britain, both Scotland and the English exude a huge amount of influence and dominance over the Irish. However, the Scottish and the Irish have basically been the whipping post of the English throughout much of their history. They have a lot in common. The intermarrying and intermingling of their cultures created the Scots-Irish or the Scots-Irish people, and the Scots-Irish people settled the American South as well as places like the Appalachians and things like that. So they became a distinct identity of British people who weren't Scottish and weren't Irish and certainly weren't English, and a lot of them ended up, millions of them came and settled in the United States. So Scotch-Irish is a very common moniker for Angloid Americans. We all family on this planet. Let's make Earth into a 5-star luxury tourist planet utopia for our global family and end wage slavery, human trafficking, animal slavery, homelessness, sickness, and war. Sure, I'm all for that, and maybe if we learn a little bit from history, like about how the Romans ran their societies and how they ended up running their society into the ground, maybe we would actually have a solution for all of the problems in our world today. So I'm with you, vegan game, but it's not it's easier said than it's done, and a lot of people have tried to propose a lot of solutions, and a lot of them have gone nowhere, and some of them have just been absolutely detrimental. Did you know the Israelis are not the chosen people? I didn't know that. I don't think they're. I mean, history teaches us is no such thing as a chosen people, but there's a lot of people who think they are chosen. It's very common for people to either think they are chosen or to think someone else is not chosen because they are chosen. So. Other questions about history or social studies, please drop them in the chat. Remember, this is not your channel, it's my channel, so please try to keep the topics on history and social studies. That would be very much appreciated. And yes, Mother Nature has no chosen people, and neither does history. I don't know what you're thanking me for, Alan, but you're very welcome. How much longer do you think America has? I don't know. I mean, an empire, a really successful empire, usually has a glory period lasting about 150 years and can last anywhere from 250 to 500 years in terms of being peak to from the time when it rises to the time when it collapses. That's what happened kind of with the Romans, at least in the West. Who knows how long the United States has in that consideration? No. Well, people of the earth are not chosen. I don't know what you mean, Darshan. Anyways, actual questions about history, social studies, the like, that's what I'm here for. That's what I want to talk about with all of you, and I'm very glad that you chose to join us. Well, yeah, you're welcome, Alan. I mean, I would love to be the chosen channel of your choice to learn about history and social studies, and all you have to do is like and subscribe and check out all the stuff we have. Transatlantic slave trade. So the transatlantic slave trade, aka the Middle Passage in the Triangle trade, was part of, like I said, a larger network of intercontinental commercialism that dominated the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries throughout much of Europe and the 18th century in Europe, between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Now, the slave trade had already existed in Africa, particularly with Arab slave traders enslaving Muslims and bringing them back before, during, and after the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which was the dominant foe to Europe at the time. The reason the Europeans start to explore westward and eventually colonize what becomes the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Latin America is because of their desire to get away from trading with Asia, going through the Silk Road and going overland through the Ottoman middlemen who were between, obviously, the Middle East and the Middle East between the Far East and the West. So there was a feeling that they should go westward instead, and that eventually led to the colonization of the Americas. The cash crops that were lucrative for the Europeans could be harvested by the Europeans themselves, or it could be harvested by the natives whom they defeated and most of the time enslaved. The natives died off heavily from diseases, so they were not a reliable labor force. So in trading with Africa, the Africans eventually start trading slaves with the Europeans, and the Europeans eventually basically get addicted to the idea of buying slaves. They were originally supposed to be indentured servants, but buying slaves from Africa and taking them across the Atlantic in the transatlantic slave trade. And there was very little, if any, racial idea towards it. It was just Africa is the place that's willing to trade slaves, so that's who we will trade slaves for. And eventually, not wanting them to return to Africa made chattel slavery much more of a popular opinion, where basically chattel slaves are slaves that are always slaves no matter what, and their children will be slaves. So putting people in permanent bondage instead of temporary bondage, which is what indentured servitude was, became the norm. And eventually, as the principles of the Enlightenment start to become popular and countries like the United States and Canada start to form, you get this idea that well, these people seem to be humans, so they must be inferior, and that's why they don't have freedom the way we have freedom. So yeah. Is the place called Tartaria real? It's real, but heavily exaggerated. The Tatars were a Turkic Mongol group that controlled large swathes of Central Asia and Eurasia during the 14th and 15th centuries. They were best known as the Golden Horde, who opposed and oppressed the Russians for a long period of time. The Tatars were what the Russians called them. Tartaria would be the land that they inhabited, but it wasn't a heavily advanced society way ahead of its time. Did you know there's slavery in Africa today? Right now, Africans are enslaved by Africans and Muslims. Yes, there's about 10 million slaves in Africa, which is more than twice as many slaves were in the American South at the beginning of the Civil War. Does the curiosity of history spread to taxonomy and like history of life and evolution? Sure. I mean, eventually, once you study prehistoric history and what humans were like before the evolution of civilization, which is when history really starts, you of course are going to become interested in the development of the different Homo groups, Homo sabelius, Homo erectus, and of course Homo sapiens. And you're going to look at Neanderthals, and you're going to look at the development of language and tools and communication as a way to actually spread ideas and develop actually a sophisticated form of society and civilization. So yeah, of course you're going to study that stuff. If you could leave a piece of history behind for your loved ones to remember, what would it be? Well, this would be one. I mean, in 100 years, assuming things are still, I mean, technology is going to be way ahead, but in 100 years, there's still a possibility that people will be able to watch YouTube or watch shorts or things like that. And that might be like old silent movies are for us today, which is the medium that was produced heavily for media 100 years ago. But the truth of the matter is, this could still be around, and I would love that. De Soto. De Soto was one of the Spanish conquistadors who spread into the southwestern United States long after Cortez conquered them. Conquistadors is the Spanish word for conqueror. These were soldiers who fought for the Spanish army. There actually weren't ever that many of them, and they were often outnumbered by the natives and would use the natives as their allies to defeat other natives. How do museums make money? Donations, curations, taxes, things like that. Why doesn't the British are rich? They had so much money. Where they had... Though they used a lot of it to build the infrastructure and civilization and society that they have today. And colonization can be expensive. It's not just that these European countries are just extracting money and have an endless supply. Investing back into the civilizations they colonized actually cost quite a bit of money. I mean, look at the 7 Years' War and look at how heavily Britain was in debt, and because of that, they taxed their American colonies, which leads to the American Revolution. From what I have heard, Greeks were the first with a language, and then other cultures advanced civilization, but which group do you think is the most responsible for advancement? It all depends what you mean by that noise, but, I mean, the Greeks are not the first ones with a language. There's the Semitic languages like Ugaritic, and then, of course, you get Arabic, Aramaic, and Hebrew from that. You have the Indo-Aryan family languages, which eventually develop into Hindi and Tamil. The earliest civilizations are the Chinese, the Indus River Valley civilization, and the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, who all kind of start around between 5,000 and 4,000 BC, with some of the earliest cities coming up around that time. And their language would have been completely different than the language of the Greeks. De Soto was in Florida. Was it De Soto who made it to Florida, or Ponce de Leon? I think it was de Leon who made it to Florida. Catholic without a written language lasted over 1,000 years. Well, you need a written language at some point, but you can live as the earliest humans did. What distinguishes humanity from the Neanderthals is that humans developed the ability to communicate with each other in a form without necessarily writing that down. We don't have the earliest human languages from 200,000 years ago. Genghis Khan's downfall. Well, Khan didn't fall down. He died. And when he died, he had his sons and grandsons, Mongkai, Ogadai, and of course Kublai, take over. Batu Khan leads the Golden Horde into Russia. Kublai Khan conquers all of Song China and creates the Yuan dynasty. Eventually, the Khanates are so huge that they basically can be empires of their own. The Ilkhanate is the one in Persia. You also have the Yuan dynasty in China, you have the Golden Horde in Russia and Central Asia and Eurasia, and of course you have the Ughatai Khanate, which kind of controls the lands between. And eventually there are offshoots of the Mongols who are derivatives, like Akbar and the Mughal Empire in India. Although the Mongols could never conquer India, a Mongol, which is what the name Mughal means in India, Akbar was able to rise and destroy the Delhi Sultanate and create one of the most powerful empires in all of history, the Mughal Empire. You also, of course, have Timurid, who, using the tactics of the Mongols and being associated with the Tatars, was able to conquer and overthrow the Ilkhanate and eventually build up his own empire, the Timurid Empire. Not Timurid, it's Tamerlane. Tamil and Indo-Aryan language are different, right? One is derivative, yes. So anyways, we can't say that Mughals were good in India, though. Well, they were very powerful. They're the largest empire that subcontinent ever knew. They were greater in land riches and influence than the Gupta, than the Mauryan, than any of the Delhi Sultanates, any of the empires that had come before, kind of pale in comparison to the influence of the Mughal. Yes, the Moors conquered Spain and Portugal. They weren't called the Moors back then. The Moors are what they come to be known as later on. The best name for them is the Umayyad Caliphate, which is kicked out of power as the main Muslim caliphate and then resettles in Al-Andalus, which of course we know today as Spain. So if you're enjoying the history and what you're learning, I'm glad. Please like and subscribe. We will be here until about 2:30 or 3:30, depending on where you are, 4:30 or 5:30. In terms of slaving people, Mongols were brutal son in the Middle East. Yeah, the Mongols sold slaves everywhere. Every civilization participated in this. The Arab slave trade was the largest enterprise of slavery in the world before it became an intercontinental system under the Europeans, the transatlantic slave trade, which I discussed earlier. The Mughals were brutal. The Mongols practiced slavery. The Mongols had huge empires, and enslaving people was a way to punish them. The Mongols, throughout much of their time in different empires and different khanates, were very tolerant of different people as long as those people were willing to pay their tribute and basically honor the Mongols as their rulers. The Mongols accepted and embraced the religions of the areas they conquered, such as Buddhism and Islam. How brutal do you think Genghis Khan was? Very brutal. It all depended on what was happening. The Mongols were very open to brutality, but they were also very open to mercy. Thank you for liking and subscribing, Alan. I appreciate you. The prospect with the Mongols was simple. We have a huge army. We've already defeated your forces in battle. If you surrender your city and all of your supplies and start paying tribute and accept our lordship and your vassalage, then we will let you live. If you do not, then we will destroy you. It's that simple. And the Mongols did this for, again, decades. And that was the usual prospect. As long as people were loyal to them, they basically let them do whatever they want as vassals. So we don't think of the Mongols as extremely tolerant because they were brutal warriors, but they actually are a pretty cosmopolitan, multicultural, and tolerant people. Look at Xanadu. Look at Kublai Khan. Look at his court and his palace as described by Marco Polo. I don't know about Muhammad al-Mahdi. Doesn't Mahdi mean Messiah? It's the Islamic equivalent of the Messiah. So where are the Mughals now? Are they working labor work in the India, like cycle repair? I don't know what you're saying. They've lost. Have you studied anthropology and or political science? I'm not an expert in them the way I am in history, but yes, I've studied both of them. You have to study these things. You have to study political science, anthropology, religion, all of that, even language, in order to be a good historian. What was the main purpose in this? Excuse me. What was the main purpose in the Civil War? Slavery. If anyone who tells you the Civil War was not about slavery is lying to you or doesn't know history. We can say that it was about states' rights and Lincoln didn't want to free all the slaves, and we can do all of these things to either to destroy Lincoln's legacy, which I think is ridiculously absurd, or to try to excuse the South for what they did, equivocate, try to sound controversial, like, ooh, the textbooks will teach you, but we really, no, the textbooks were right. I'm an orthodox historian on this one. The Civil War is from its beginning about slavery. Now, the beginnings of the Civil War are secession from the Union and whether or not that's constitutional and punishing the South for doing that. But the only reason the South seceded was because of slavery. The only reason the South and the North had different economies, different societies, and states' rights was an issue was because the South was constantly worried that the North, which was far more populous, would use its advantage, particularly in the House of Representatives, to basically make slavery illegal. Slavery was always the issue. Always. I don't know I don't delete anything. Who's deleting stuff? The Mughals did surrender to the British, right? Eventually, but they were well outmatched and well in decline by the time the British show up. If you look at the 16th and 17th century, the Mughal Empire was pretty formidable. By the time the British East India Company, Robert Clive, and the 7 Years' War happen, the Mughal Empire is in decline. The Maharatha Confederacy the Mughal Emperor rules India in name only. He's a ceremonial monarch by that time. Who were the people who put the now destroyed Buddhas in the desert Muslim country? I don't know. Al-Kibulan? I don't know what you mean. Okay, I don't know about that, Tony. Any society that becomes multicultural dies. Well, it's not a symptom of dying necessarily. It's just a symptom of having different cultures have different influences, being centers of learning, of trade, of cultural exchange. That's not necessarily a death sentence. Some societies, in fact, many societies throughout history have become even more robust, wealthy, and powerful when they have exposure to goods, services, and ideas from other parts of the world. The Greeks spread Hellenism all over the world, and that created multicultural societies. In Persia, the Romans were multicultural in many ways. yeah, that's not a symptom of death necessarily. Were you serious when you claimed that the fascist movement in Europe in the 1930s were socialist in outlook? Yes, I was serious. Although the fascists used traditional nationalist, cultural, and patriotic emblems, particularly that would be associated more with the right than the left, which is why we see them as a far-right group, that and they hated communism, fascism was created by socialists. Fascism is a derivative of socialism. Fascism used an authoritarian mixed economy, planned economy, where the government tells the corporations what they will make and what they will do. The 4-year plans of Goering in Germany are not that different than the 5-year plans of Stalin in the Soviet Union. So, yeah, John, I was 100% serious, and I can 100% prove it. Let me see, other things. Just FYI, folks, this dude is an alt historian, MAGA dude. FYI, on top of this, he reached ChatGPT to answer your questions in real time. What's fascinating is I've never used ChatGPT on this live stream. Never. This is all from my head. I don't talk about politics. I don't endorse political candidates. I will talk about a political topic only in the vein of history. ADF, you don't know what you're talking about. You're basing it off of one comment I made to you one time that you saw as pro-MAGA, which was really just recognizing a historical reality, and now you're just poisoning the well. So just FYI, folks, ignore ADF. Yeah, please watch this and all my other stuff. Callan, I can help you with a lot of different history classes. Or Kalen, is carbon dating precision enough to tell if a piece of cloth found in a tomb 50,000 years old, or is it science full of crap? Well, science is not full of crap. I mean, there's plenty of evidence to think that carbon dating is reliable. Looking at minerals and elements within a rock can help us tell us the age of rocks. Radiometric dating, absolute dating, things like this are particularly reliable, and science has advanced. That doesn't mean science is perfect or that it can't advance more. I mean, they're generally reliable. Through history, I believe the Persians helped Israel. I think it's time for Israel to help Iran now. Thoughts? Oh, go with that wherever you want, Noise. I'm not going to share my take on that. The Persians were extremely merciful to the Jews and the Israelites compared to the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Let me see here. Would you say the Israeli and Persians are the same people? All are children of Abraham, supposedly. No, that's they might be Semitic. The Persians are not Arabs. They are not. Actually, they're not Semites. They are not Middle Easterners. They are Indo-Aryans. They have a different genetic background and makeup than the Jews, than the Arabs, than the people of the Middle East. Because proximity is not the same. They are not. They are not the same. Farsi is not a family language in the same family language as Arabic, Aramaic, and Hebrew. It's a misnomer to say that. Muslims believe that the promise of Abraham goes to Ishmael instead of Isaac, the way the New Testament seems to imply it. So because of that, because Persia is overwhelmingly Muslim today, people think that means that. But no, that it doesn't mean anything. There are Muslims in Malaysia. They are not related. They are not of the same people as the Jews. That is a claim based off of Islamic theology mixed with an understanding of the Middle East, a misunderstanding of the Persians being part of the Middle East, which they are not. Hello, Manbear. Hello, London. You ever thought about going on Jeopardy? I watch Jeopardy every day. It's awesome. I love Jeopardy. Hello, Landon. If he uses ChatGPT, that's fine, but he doesn't because he doesn't know the Empire. No, I actually don't know that. Let me see. Yeah, it looks like we're on Pilatus. Well, this is the Roman Forum, so my background is, yeah, you can see the different courts, although this may not be in Rome. This could be supposed to be Jerusalem. I don't know what this background is, actually. But you can see the Roman architecture everywhere. He doesn't use ChatGPT. He never said he was MAGA. He just historically knows his facts and talks about them. Stop with the malarkey. Yep, absolutely. What method do you use to jar your farts, sir? I don't know. Is it the method you use to waste your time? Because it's working pretty well in that case. What do you think about Taliban recent news on punishing women without breaking bones? Like, seriously. You can punish people without breaking bones. I don't know much about it. I really actually don't. Yeah, the Muslims of Iran are Shia, and that's because of the Safavid Empire. The Muslims in Iran have a very different history. Iran has a very different history than the rest of the Middle East. Persia has a very different history than the rest of the Middle East. In many ways, it's not the Middle East, it's South Asia. Why do you trivialize what Lincoln said and wrote all the way up to a few days before his death? I don't trivialize anything Lincoln said or wrote. I understand it in the context, and I know that Abraham Lincoln had nothing but absolute hatred for slavery. Lincoln saying that if he could, Lincoln was also a Unionist who was following the Constitution, even though you don't think he was. And he believed that the job of the war was to rebuild the Union, and if that meant that the slaves that he couldn't end slavery, then he couldn't end slavery. However, he realized that slavery was the issue of the war, and so was able to kill two birds with one stone. If we were to actually allow someone from history to have nuance in their position and actually be able to reconcile differing positions and find ways to solve multiple problems at the same time, then we could get over this bullcrap nonsense by people who just want to hate Abraham Lincoln when he's clearly one of the greatest people who's ever lived. It's not. I don't think it's a stretch to say Lincoln is one of the better people in human history, and it would be good if our leaders today, whoever they are, wherever they are, emulated Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's brilliance is that he realized the war was about slavery, but he also chose the opportune moment to redirect everything towards slavery. After the Emancipation Proclamation, there's no going back. Lincoln also used his influence to get the 13th Amendment passed. Lincoln hated slavery. Lincoln knew slavery was wrong, but Lincoln also realized that abolitionism, which we all think is what every single anti-slavery person was. No, most people thought abolitionism was crazy, even if they were against slavery. Lincoln, like a lot of people, believed that slavery would die out if it was suffocated, so he was against the slavery being spread into the Western territories. This was anathema to the South, and they believed he would take away the slaves because Lincoln was against slavery. He had huge moral objections to slavery. I mean, it's obvious. Everybody knows it. And if you want me to talk faster, then I can talk faster. I hope you enjoy me talking faster. I really, really, really hope you do. Lincoln was the definition of a man who could embody the historical movement he lived in, yes, and the historical moment he lived in, yes, and that makes him a victim of his time. Lincoln had backwards views that were wrong by any stretch of the imagination today, but he was forward-thinking and progressive for his time, and he was brilliant. There's just no doubt about it. If mixing too many cultures together did not work, what do you think America has become? I think we're imploding. People have become extremely tribal in America. People are tribal by nature, and I think that's why multiculturalism is difficult. But you can have cosmopolitan multicultural societies where there's an exchange of ideas and trade, as long as you have an undergirded society and culture that is the historical root of that particular country or location. What made the Romans successful was they were still very much Roman, despite the fact that they were also willing to accept, assimilate, and acquire different ideas, goods, resources, cultures into their empire. So when you conquer Egypt, you don't just destroy all of their gods and say you can't practice it. That's one way to spark rebellion. But to actually worship the Egyptian gods is just assimilation into your culture, which the Romans were doing throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries. It's surprising to me that the GOC was founded by the United Nations. What's the GOC? See, I'm not ChatGPT, so I don't know that. Why so friendly? It's my job. The old-timers called Akubukan the motherland way before the Romans changed it to Africa. Okay, then. You are aware of Winston Churchill was involved in putting Mussolini in power in the 1920s at a time he was advocating firing on striking workers in the UK. Yes, I'm aware of that Churchill did that. Churchill and Mussolini actually were on the same team for a while. Mussolini was not just always in bed with Hitler. In fact, Mussolini played the middleman throughout much of the 1930s. But Churchill came to recognize that Mussolini was a problem, knew that Hitler was a problem, and had known the Soviets were a problem for a long time. Can you tell me about Kristallnacht? UNGOC. Oh, that's what we meant by GOC. Kristallnacht is the Night of the Broken Glass. It's when the Nazis persecuted and terrorized Jews in many of their cities, I think in 1935, right before the Nuremberg laws. Greetings, Belisarius. Great to have you. Let me see. Saudi Arabia is actually called Arabia. Saudi is the name of the family. Yes, Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. Nabatea is what the Romans called it. What is the history of the Caucasus and the Savans? What is the origin? Don't know enough about it. A lot wanted to send them back to Africa too, not have freedom in USA. They didn't believe that African Americans had the skills or would get along well enough with former slave owners in order to live. And there were not only whites who believed this, but blacks, like Frederick Douglass for a while, believed this. And of course, this idea continued with black separation movements like Marcus Garvey. African nationalism was popular, and returning to Africa or African majority countries like Jamaica or Haiti was common into the 20th century for black Americans. And there are plenty of whites, going back to the founders, who believe that if we free the slaves, there'll be animosity between them and their former slave owners, and they won't have the necessary skills to survive and live in our society properly. History can be very friendly, especially the way I deliver it. History is not always written by the victor. That is not true. There's plenty of history, especially history from below, that is not written by the victor. And if you can harmonize enough of history, you can realize that sometimes the victor got it right. He got more right than just winning his battles. Sometimes he got the events right. And it's often not the facts of history that we disagree about. It's our interpretation of the facts of history that we disagree about. Oh, yeah. Okay. Are you a Christian? Are the Mongols mixed with Russia? Yeah, they mixed with Russia. They conquered Russia for a while. They didn't really mix with them as much. The Golden Horde was kind of to the south of Russia and kind of let Russia have its independence as long as they were tributaries of them. Eventually, Ivan III cuts this off in 1480. Are you a Christian? I don't share my political or religious views on the channel. If you want me to analyze a particular religious doctrine or idea based on a historical context, give a super chat. If you want me to go in detail on a political topic, once again, for a historical perspective, again, give a super chat. Is it true that the Bolsheviks were Jews? Yes. It's also true that Jesus was a Jew. We hate the foundation because, you know what? Nobody comes onto this channel and ever asks me, was Jesus of Nazareth a Jew? But everybody comes onto the channel to ask if the Bolsheviks were Jews because they're trying to stir the pot. They're trying to start problems. Yeah, the Bolsheviks were disproportionately Jewish. Not all of them. Stalin wasn't, but Lenin was. Trotsky was. Marx and Engels were both Jews. So what? Let me see. The Night of the Long Knife. Yeah, that's different. The Night of the Long Knives was the Nazi purification and persecution of their ranks, with Ernst Röhm being overthrown and killed. 4 days before his death, Lincoln told General Benjamin Butler that he still believed in the forced relocation of freed slaves. That's true, but Lincoln believed that could happen, but he also believed blacks could have a place in America, in the American story and in the American experiment. He believed that it might be better for them to go back to Africa. That was a movement that was extraordinarily popular. Lincoln did not believe blacks were equal to whites. I've said this many times. And if you think you're going to win brownie points and make me change my view on Lincoln being the best president in U.S. history because you mention a letter that he wrote to a general about his beliefs of where Africans belong, then you're out of SOL. You're straight out of luck. That doesn't change my thoughts on Lincoln. Lincoln had a much more progressive and open-minded view about slaves for that time than any other president before him, and certainly the presidents after him. Look at the guy who takes over after Lincoln. You got a racist Andrew Johnson. And despite the efforts of Grant and Hayes to mitigate problems for African Americans, Lincoln is by far, in the 19th century, the most pro-black president you can find. No other president comes up to that standard. Not since the founding. You have to get into the 1900s until you find a president that actually believes blacks have a legitimate role in the society and have some sort of equality. I don't think there's a U.S. president who thinks blacks are equals to whites till at least John F. Kennedy. I mean, I don't know about Coolidge and Harding and those guys. Maybe Herbert Hoover did. FDR certainly didn't. Truman certainly didn't, a Missouri Democrat. Lyndon Johnson didn't, even though he passed the Civil Rights Act. Sometimes what is politically expedient is helpful, but I don't think you can have you have a president who's more progressive, more woke, if you want to use that terminology, about the status of African Americans in the United States and its story than Abraham Lincoln until the 20th century, and deep into the 20th century, not early in it. Look at Woodrow Wilson and what he thought about Africans. Look at how the Americans. Look at how Calvin Coolidge treated foreigners. Look at what FDR did to the Japanese. You're not really going to get somebody who's actually believing in the equality of the races until probably Eisenhower, and I don't know that Eisenhower really believes it. History is a foreign country, and sometimes vacations are nice. I love that. That is a great tagline. I'm going to pin that message. Let me see. Kristallnacht was 38. I thought it was earlier. Was Yahweh a storm god? Yahweh is the name for the Jewish God. The Jews do not even use his name, but he is I am from the book of Exodus. The Christians, of course, believe this is Jesus. A storm god? I don't know. I would be skeptical of that, just like I'd be skeptical that Allah is the moon god of the Arabs. Everyone forgets Lincoln was also a vampire slayer. Yeah, nobody mentions that. Asking someone to kick it is only okay when they're not holding a baby. Oh, that was funny. Is the first guy to use a cellular phone still alive? Don't know. I think the first cell phone came out like the prototype was in the 1970s, so it's a good chance he might be. Yeah, it was Wilson who showed Birth of a Nation, not Coolidge. Coolidge wasn't racist per se. He was, by today's standards, for his time, he was pretty much in the middle. Coolidge believed that if America's economic prosperity increased, then that would help blacks. And blacks actually experienced their best economic and cultural and artistic growth in the Harlem Renaissance, in the Great Migrations of the 1920s during Coolidge's presidency. So Coolidge, like Reagan 60 years later, isn't like waving his banner of civil rights per se, but he is hoping that by bringing economic prosperity to all Americans, that will include African Americans, and there is some truth to that. It was Wilson who did that. Wilson also segregated the federal government. It was Truman who desegregated the military, and then it became kind of obvious after the last World War, what you call World War II, what I think is World War III, that segregating African Americans wasn't helping anyone, especially them. Was the shooter of Charlie arrested? Yes. Stop asking that. Why would they believe what? Can you talk about the California Republic? Yeah, there's a short period in California history where they overthrow the Mexicans and establish a Angloid American government that is not part of the United States, but this is quickly wrapped up because the United States takes over at the end of the Mexican-American War anyways. And of course, the symbol for their image was the grizzly bear, which is why the bear is the California flag to this day. Mama said alligators are angry because they all got them teeth and no toothbrush. That's probably true. Can you tell us about the Etruscans? Okay, so the Etruscans are kind of the Romans before Rome. The Romans start off as a group of Latin people. Latins were people in the middle of Italy. In the south, you have different groups of people, of tribes, and you have the Magna Graecia, which is Greece, is continual exploits into that area. The north of the Romans, you have the Etruscans, and nobody actually knows exactly where the Etruscans come from, but they settled. Some people think they are Phoenicians, that's possible, or Semitic, or from Africa, or even Spain. But they settled this northern, or from the Transcaucasus area, or from they're a Turkic group that migrated from Turkey. But they basically have all the power over Rome that Rome will later have over all the other people around them. And so they're a dominant, not an empire, but a country that controls a lot of the area of northern and central Italy and several of the last kings of Rome. And if you want to go learn more, go watch my video on the Roman monarchy and how it lasted and how it worked, were actually Etruscans. So I actually have a list of them, and the last 3 Roman kings were Etruscans, and then Rome eventually threw off the Etruscans, and the Etruscans would decline and the Romans would eventually conquer them. The Etruscans were known for their beautiful pottery, for painting and frescoes. The Romans would take a lot of their artistic notions from the Etruscans, as well as their military notions from the Etruscans. Dozens of leaders in other countries freed blacks with few or zero deaths. Dozens of leaders in other countries did not have millions of blacks in bondage living in their countries when they did that. I'm sorry. I don't know how that makes it any less impressive that Lincoln freed the slaves. I really, really don't. You have countries that did free the slaves without civil wars. How is there going to be a civil war in Great Britain when the vast majority of people do not own slaves in the island? It doesn't make any sense. Does anyone know about the Etruscans? There's a lot to not know about the Etruscans. Was Harding a bad president? Historians since his presidency all seem to bash him. He was lazy, he was unmotivated, he was corrupt, he was very well aware of that, he was a philanderer, he was a likable guy, but he wasn't a good person. I see a lot of comparisons to Bill Clinton. And I'm not saying that Bill Clinton is a bad president, because I actually think he's a good president. Clinton lived his entire presidency, but you've got a wife you have a complex relationship with, to say the least. You have a president who really struggles with his own personal dalliances. Harding had at least 1 or 2 illegitimate children, which is scandalous in the early 20th century, to say the least. But you also have a very likable, affable man who's willing to govern from the center, very hands-off in a lot of his things, and you have a growing period of prosperity. It would have been very interesting to see how the 20s would have worked out had Harding been president for both terms. He wins by the largest popular vote margin in U.S. history in 1920. Harding was a likable and interesting guy, and so I think there are comparisons between him and Bill Clinton, except that Clinton's wife used him to get into politics, whereas Harding's wife probably killed him. Yes, Florence Harding was tired of her husband's dalliances and was the only person present when Warren died in a San Francisco hotel room in 1923. Although Harding had had a bad heart before, and it's very likely that the president died naturally, there are plenty of people, and I have shared this opinion before, who think that Florence Harding murdered her husband. Harding was effective in dealing with international arms agreements. He's the first president to pass an international arms restriction agreement with the British and the Japanese in 1922. The French were involved in that as well. He also mitigated some of the economic woes of that came at the end of the war when wartime production ceased. Harding was not a dumb man, and he wasn't an ineffective president. He was just not a very good president morally, and corruption and scandal can ruin a presidency. Bill Clinton would probably be a B or A tier president. If I still think he's a B tier president, but he'd probably be considered one of the better presidents of the 20th century, just based on his domestic, especially his domestic legacy, if he had not had the Monica Lewinsky scandal. My throat's getting dry. Please like and subscribe. And we are only 40 minutes in. We will be going 2 hours today to make up for our missed live stream yesterday. We usually do Fridays at 6, Saturdays at 3, and Sundays at 4. And tomorrow we'll be lecturing on a topic that you can vote on exclusively here on YouTube. And you can check out all of our history content, short and long, here at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. History is like looking into the toilet after a poop. Sure, you can be curious, but most of it's crappy for everyone involved. Again, very, very good, Goober. Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate that. You're very, very kind. Was Jesus circumcised? Yeah, he was a Jew. The New Testament actually literally says he gets circumcised. There were already boats in their way to California before the war with Mexico even started. It was all planned. Sure. If leftover, I don't know what that is. Atlanteans? No. This isn't leftover Atlantis. This is a Roman city probably during the Pax Romana, when the Romans were at their political and military height. This could be Jerusalem. You see palm trees. You see Roman architecture. You see the Forum, a marketplace where people would meet and talk. Obviously, Rome had the most famous of these. So yes, this is a Roman historically inspired background. If Chiang Kai-shek had defeated Mao, what would China be like today? Great question, Tony. It's Jianji Shi in China. Chiang Kai-shek to the west, but Xi was unpopular with the peasantry. It would have been interesting to see how he would have dealt with. He really didn't seem to care about the suffering of the peasantry, of the lower classes. Dealing with that, because China was overwhelmingly agricultural at the time, would have been very interesting to see. What kind of aid and support would have he gotten from the United States as a bulwark against the Soviet Union? If Jianji Shi wins in 1949 and China does not become communist, I don't think the Cold War lasts long. I don't think that Korea is already divided between the North and the South. I think the North Koreans don't have a shot. I think Shek helps the Americans overwhelm North Korea, and North Korea stays democratic. This is all hypothetical, counterfactual. There's no way to tell what contingent, free-willed human beings will do in a particular circumstance. I don't think you have the problems in Vietnam you do. I basically think that East Asia does not struggle with communism the way it does. The Soviet Union doesn't get off the ground the way it does. If he defeats Mao in 1949 and is an ally in the West, I think the Soviets are under immense pressure to basically play by the rules the Americans want to, and maybe the Cold War is a lot shorter. Also, you don't have the Great Leap Forward, you don't have the Cultural Revolution, you don't have a massive genocide of 60 to 80 million people, which is what Mao did. I think in almost every single metric on the global front, if you think communism is evil, and you think the West was immoral, or at least imperfect, but better, then if you're an American, rooting for the Americans. If you're a Westerner, rooting for Western democracy and capitalism. If you think North Korea shouldn't be communist, which I do, for instance, or if you think that Vietnam was a disastrous war, and could have been avoided, then you would probably want to root for Chiang Kai-shek over Mao Zedong. What Mao did that allowed him to gain power was curry the favor of the peasantry, which had been left behind by the barons and warlords who had oppressed them heavily, and who Shek had teamed up with in order to gain a power base. So in order for the nationalist Kuomintang to gain that power base, they had basically allowed the leftover barons and warlords, who basically had sapped up as much of Chinese land as they could after the empire fell, to mistreat the commoners. So Sun Yat-sen had started this, Chiang Kai-shek continued this, but it's a fascinating question to me. What would have happened to the world? May seem like a net benefit, but is it a benefit to the people of China itself? That's a little more complex. But then again, you don't have the Great Leap Forward. You don't have that. You might have had the floods and the famines, which are huge in China anyways, and do kill lots of people. Apologists for Mao Zedong will often talk about how these things are just natural things that would have happened to anyone, but the fact that the crop yields were much lower because of man-made collectivization and factors is absolutely undeniable at this point. Nixon, probably the stupidest thing Richard Nixon ever said wasn't, "I am not a crook," but the lives of the people of China are vastly better under Mao, which wasn't true at all. It was better for some people who hadn't been killed and who had been high-ranking members of the party, although many of them were put on the chopping block during the Cultural Revolution. It would have been very interesting to see what China would have become in the 20th century. I think China would have probably been what it had been in the 19th century, kind of a heavily influenced Western puppet in Asia. And is that better for China than the genocide that Mao committed? I don't know. Did you know the bird known as the turkey was named after the country? If I could go back in time, I'd pitch it was named after African country, Djibouti. So every Thanksgiving I could eat Djibouti. You're good. You're very good. Brazil didn't. Yes, Brazil is an example where they freed the slaves. Brazil isn't a republic. Brazil was an empire where they were able to free the slaves a lot quicker. Pedro II. And President Lyndon Johnson was responsible for half a century of reverse discrimination. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Yeah, talking about the bandits doing their thing in Brazil. Yeah, Brazil imported many more black slaves than the U.S. No, you've got to understand the difference here. The Portuguese imported a lot of slaves to Brazil. Brazil got rid of slavery soon after it declared its independence because it had an emperor. It had a different political structure. It wasn't made up of states the way the United States was. Its government was completely different than the U.S. You have to play with the cards you are dealt. The founders were, and if you want to use this as a way to attack Lincoln, you can use it and say, yeah, other countries didn't need a civil war to free their slaves. Yeah, that's a good point. But how's that Lincoln's fault? Isn't that Jefferson and Madison and Washington's fault? Which it isn't their fault either. You have to understand the different complex cultures you have in different areas with different political philosophies. The Portuguese controlled Brazil until the 1820s. It was Napoleon who ruined Brazil for the Portuguese because the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil and they got so tired of it they asked the son of the king of Portugal, a man named Dom Pedro, to become their emperor. When he died, his son took over, and it was his son who ended slavery in 1838. Unk is live. Yes, I am live, and I went live about 45 minutes ago. Let me see. I know you said you don't talk politics, but how do you feel about the historicity of a claim that the conflict in the Levant between Muslims and Jews has been going on for centuries? I mean, it's true, although it's not really true. Conflict between Muslim and Jew has been part of the history between the two religions. There's no doubt that Jews lived in second-class citizenship to Muslims throughout much of the Middle Ages. However, Jews preferred to live under Muslims in the Middle East and North Africa than they did under the Europeans during the Inquisition, for instance, when the Catholic Church was particularly persecutive of Jews. Persecutory? I don't know. Anyways, so it's true the conflict has been going on for centuries. The conflict over the land has been something that's going on for millennia. The Jews, the Israelites conquer it under supposedly Joshua, according to the Bible, although that could have been someone else, we don't know. There's about as much evidence that Joshua lived as there is that Muhammad lived. And we think Muhammad's a historical figure. And if we say that might not be true, we get threatened to be killed. But if I say Joshua from the Bible isn't real, then nobody really cares. So the Israelites supposedly leave Egypt. The Exodus happens. There does seem to be evidence historically of the Hebrew population settling in that area during the New Kingdom, and that New King and that could be the Exodus. Who knows what that is? But they settle in that area and they fight against the Canaanites. And then eventually that land is taken over by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And then the Christians and the Byzantine Empire control it until the Muslims take it. So the Jews do not have a direct conflict with the Muslims, but the conflict over the area, which involves Jew, Christian, and Muslim, since all three believe that's their holiest sites, has been going on for centuries. And believe me, it is a religious conflict. And it was a religious conflict when the Muslims came out of the Arabian Peninsula and conquered it in the 630s. And it's been like that ever since for 1,400 years. That's why the Crusades happened, and that's why 1948 happens and everything else. So, good evening, Edward. How do you think Alexander would have done as a statesman had he not died in campaign? Not well. He was able to, I just think he wouldn't have enjoyed administrative power. I think he was smart enough to do decent at it, but I think his heart was for the battlefield. But a great question. Go check out my video on Alexander the Great, the Roman monarchs, all of that stuff. Let me see. If you research the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll get a lot of clarity regarding being inhabitants of the Middle East and who they were. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I've actually seen them in exhibits, are parchments of ancient Jewish literature, most notably the Tanakh, which is the Old Testament in Christianity. And since I'm in a Christian-inspired country, I guess I should call it the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, whatever. The Dead Sea Scrolls were copies of and translations of into Hebrew or copies of the Hebrew text compiled by a group known as the Essenes, and the Essenes were a religious sect that was separatist. They didn't believe in worshiping the Hebrew God at the temple, and they believed that the Hebrew society was being corrupted by being basically civilized. So they lived in desert communities where they copied down these manuscripts and stuff like that, and they didn't want to interact at all with the external political powers like Greece and Rome. So they were basically the Amish of their time, and they produce, like the Amish, extremely dutiful work, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are eventually discovered in a cave. And these are copies of the Old Testament, which actually carry a lot of resemblance and consistency with the Masoretic texts, which are the basis for the Old Testament before the Dead Sea Scrolls were founded in the 1940s. So the Essenes are a Jewish sect, but what does that prove necessarily, Noise? Oh wait, he was talking to Noise about that, not even me. How did Malaysia end up a Muslim? Conquest and trade and spreading. To say Islam always spread by conquest is just not true. Most West Africans who embrace Islam, like the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires, do it willingly in order to gain advantages and trade allies. Muslims spread their faith all the time. Conversion to Islam is huge in that faith. I don't know exactly how it got to Malaysia, but I don't believe it was through conquest. Could you go into more detail of how the Soviets won the Russian Civil War against others like the Whites and the Bolsheviks and stuff? Well, the Soviets are the Bolsheviks. So the Russian Civil War is a jumbled mess, and it's an extremely dark story, far darker than the Spanish Civil War, which was really bad, and far darker, of course, than the American Civil War, which cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, and is not a heroic thing at all, according to certain people on this channel. But the Russian Civil War is the inevitable result, and I don't like to use the word inevitable, but it is the inevitable result of the army, the Russian army, fighting the front lines against the German Wehrmacht, turning on a government that couped power and was opposed to the war. The Russians had not done well in the Great War, and this is part of why the Russian Revolution happens. The army is holding on by a thread. But the idea that the Russian Civil War started because a bunch of soldiers mutinied and overturned and they hated the war and they hated the Tsar is malarkey. Inflation led to breadlines, which led to riots, which led to revolution in February or March because they used the old-style calendars in 1917. The Tsar is forced to abdicate because he's lied to and basically told this is how you save your country and save the war effort. He's sent into exile with his family in Russia, kept under house arrest. A provisional government is set up that runs the political side of things, while the social side of things is led by different types of workers' councils for different labor forces. These are called Soviets. And the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, are a fringe group of the far left party in Russia. There are three different communistic-like groups in Russia in 1917-1918, and that is the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, who become the Soviets, the Mensheviks, and the Socialist Revolutionaries. The Socialist Revolutionaries have the most political and popular support. The Bolsheviks are the minority, but they lie and call themselves the majority. So if you consider the Soviet Union a place full of contradictions, paradoxes, and lies, it goes all the way back to Lenin himself. Lenin had started the Bolsheviks believing in quick, bloody revolution. And he wanted quick, bloody revolution. But Lenin wasn't in Russia in 1917. Lenin was living in Switzerland because the Tsar had exiled him. And so Lenin basically believed that the revolution was not going to happen. If you look at Marxist doctrine, Marx believed that there needed to be a bourgeois revolution so that the capitalism could be created and democracy could be created, and then that could be overthrown by a communist revolution. And I would argue, a lot of people would argue, that there's nothing resembling communism in Russia in 1917 and 18. I think that's absolute nonsense. I would argue that the bourgeois revolution happens in February and March, and then Russia is not industrialized enough, does not experience democracy and capitalism, and then the Bolsheviks basically say, well, we don't care, and then in October seize power in the winter, in the October Revolution, which is really a coup. They storm the Winter Palace, throw out all the guards and the provisional government. They force Alexander Kerensky to resign as president of the provisional government, and they give all the power to the local Soviets. Lenin returns to Moscow and basically on a premise of promising peace, land, and bread, agrees to hold elections, free and fair elections, to secure the history of Russia. When these elections happen, the Bolsheviks are defeated by the socialist revolutionaries, who are the popular ones with the farmers, who most Russians are, and Lenin basically ignores the results and seizes power for the Bolsheviks. And from that period on, the Bolsheviks, pretending to speak for the Soviets, are going to become synonymous with the Soviets. The army, which the Bolsheviks are the only one major group calling for the end of the war. The army, which doesn't want to do this, at least the leadership of the army, turns on that, and all of a sudden you have different military leaders like Lavar Kornilov, the leader of the Russian army in the war, and Admiral Kolchak in the east, who are going to unify these disparate parts and forces to basically try to march on Moscow and seize power. Now, historians have said that these guys were all czarists. That's a lie. The real truth of the matter is, if you read Richard Pipes, he goes into a lot of detail on this. They are, Sean McKeon has one of the best books I've ever read on the entire topic. They basically believed in some sort of election. They believed in a free and fair election and in the restoration of a Duma, of a parliament, and of a representative government. So they were not liberals, but they believed in some sort of restoration of a free and fair election in Russia. The Bolsheviks had seized power without a free and fair election and then canceled the free and fair election. So the lines are drawn, and the Red Army looks like it's really in trouble until Trotsky, of all people, becomes the leader of the Red Army and basically says, if you fight against the whites, you may win. If you don't fight against them, you will die. They're called White Russians because of, well, I don't know why. I guess they want to consider themselves pure, but they represent the czarists, the liberals, the Democrats, everyone who basically wants Russia to be not communist. The red comes to represent the Bolsheviks. They have all of the centralized power, most of the mechanized factories, and the ability to mobilize an army a lot quicker. The Russia and Britain and France and the United States get involved because they think that if they can bring the Russians back, they can win the World War. The Americans will win the World War with the others by the end of 1918, so them helping the Russians becomes superfluous. There's a group called the Czechoslovak League who helps the White Russians because they believe that the White Russians will help them get their own country in Czechoslovakia, which they get anyways. So there's foreign interventionism. Churchill actually believes that the foreign intervention should continue even after the war is over, and Lloyd George tells him to shut up. Because the war is so costly. The British don't want to lose any more men fighting in Russia, of all places. But Churchill might have been right about that one. Without foreign support and with continual persecution of the peasantry, similar to what the nationalists do in China, the White Russians lose support. The peasantry kind of defaults to the Bolsheviks, who promise them peace, land, and bread. And they eventually, through a lot of brutality, a lot of fighting, and a lot of strict discipline in the Red Army — Trotsky was notoriously oppressive — win. And that is how Russia, and even after that, they're still fighting from peasant partisans who Lenin basically sets forests, takes gas and pours them into forests to poison people, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people at a time, to stop the opposition to his regime. So the nonsensical notion that Russia just becomes communist because of people being tired of the Tsar and all of is nonsense. The Bolsheviks weren't even going to get power. Kornilov had tried to usurp Kerensky, and Kerensky had turned on Kornilov, which had destroyed his power base, which is how the Bolsheviks were able to usurp that and then overthrow it. Lenin was living in Finland in July of 1918 and says, the revolution isn't going to work. I'm going to have to wait. It's not my turn. And then 4 months later, he's in power. So I could go on for this for hours. Russian history is my particular emphasis. please check out my long-form video on the Russian Revolution. I should probably make another long-form one about the Russian Civil War because it is brutal. It is awful. Peasants are starving. They are often being abused in all sorts of horrible ways by the whites and even the reds sometimes. Pogroms, anti-Jewish sentiment is huge. Yes, I brought that up because it's important. The Bolsheviks are seen. As this. They're all Jews. The Bolsheviks the Soviets later on are extremely insensitive to the Jews in Russia. Persecution of the church, war communism, seizing the means of production happen all throughout the war by the Reds, which leads to black markets where that's the only way you can find affordable food and goods. Millions of people start to starve. People resort to cannibalism, and it looks like the world's ending. Russia between 1917 and 1923 is an extremely unpleasant, horrifying place to live. Lenin even realizes this and kind of pulls back on some of his more radical demands and basically opens up markets with the new economic policy before his death in order to ensure that the Russian people just don't all starve. And in the midst of this, he finally destroys his enemies and is able to rename it the Soviet Union in 1922. Sorry, I know that's a long answer to a short question, but Russian history, if you couldn't tell, is my passion. This is my particular field. My master's is on the Great Game. You can read it on our Substack. And check us out on Discord for further discussions, and you can follow us on Discord, Substack, all of these great places, and follow Harsinet's channel where he reviews U.S. presidents. How are you today? Could you tell us some info about the state of Africa just before the Atlantic slave trade and the wars that were going on between tribes in the interior? Well, it was interior warfare and tribal warfare was common, and the spoils of war were often slaves. And the Africans are more than willing to do this. One of the most important African kingdoms of the time is the Kingdom of Congo, Kongo, not Congo, but that's where we get the name. And they are near the Congolese River and all of these different areas, but they are very interested in trading with the Portuguese, and they actually convert their king, Alfonso, converts to Christianity, receives a European, Portuguese name, and creates ties of trade that involve the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. So the Portuguese, most of the trade is off the western coast of Africa. Some of it's off the south coast. Very little of it's in the east of Africa, and almost none of it is in the north. The north is dominated by the Ottoman Empire, which has its own slave trade network that is also intercontinental. Slaves are picked off from Europe all the time by what become known as the Barbary pirates. The Ottomans have been trading slaves for a long time. Islam does not allow Muslims to trade, but you can to enslave. But Muslim, if you are a Muslim, you can enslave non-Muslims. So. The turbo changed the world? Sure. Hello, Terry. Is it true that Woodrow Wilson was a Jew? Everyone's a Jew. Everyone's a Jew. But who was the first ever to come up with somebody had to be called a king or queen? Rex is the Roman term. I forget, Regina, Rex and Regina. Yes, those are two English names. They are king and queen. It's Latin. Kings are common all throughout human history. Princes, kings, rulers, even if you want to call them emperors. Kings used to rule over cities, so the city-state was extraordinarily common. And eventually people like Hammurabi, Sargon of Akkad in Mesopotamia start to develop actual kingdoms where they conquer more than just their city or their surrounding cities and start to absorb larger and larger areas. Almost every civilization that starts off as a disunited civilization where you have a similar language, culture, and religion, but you have different rulers in different areas. The Egyptians are the first ones to have one ruler over all of their area, the pharaoh. Yep. Yeah, Ars, I agree with you about the Americans. The Americans had a very different dynamic, especially politically, than those other countries that ended slavery sooner and less bloody. Hello, Chris. Chinese communism, next iteration of Western government? No. Thoughts on Captain Underpants? Don't know enough about him. I spoke to my grandfather recently, and he argued that history doesn't matter for the modern problems. What do you think about this? I disagree. The modern problems exist because of history, and there's such a thing as contemporary history. It's not clear that they produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's why it's also called the Qumran community. They took a boat to Malaysia. The Qumran is the Essenes. So that's the community. This is a movement of people. Qumran is where they produced it. The Essenes are who they most likely were. I think the Dead Sea Scrolls, just due to the fact that it was found by unbiased archaeologists and its clear narrative of who were the indigenous people. Yeah. The Russian Civil War is the most confusing thing in history I've ever heard of. It's horrific. No, it's not just confusing, it's horrific. If you think it's chaotic hearing about it, imagine living through it. You also have the Tsar, most of his family, a lot of the nobility, many of the church hierarchy murdered by the Bolsheviks. The whites did plenty of murdering too. This isn't just communism bad, although, yeah, communism is bad. I just don't know why I have to say that anymore, but here we are. Were the Khazars real? Yes, the Khazars were real. If I could save a union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. Oh my gosh, really? I've never heard that quote from Abraham Lincoln. I've never heard Abraham Lincoln say he would free the union, he would save the union without freeing a single slave. I'm aware of what Lincoln said about saving the union. He was a unionist. He ran on a unionist platform. He denied the legality of secession. That is why the Civil War started. The reason they seceded and caused that in the first place was slavery. They knew they were fighting for their slaves. If Lincoln was just purely a unionist, then why the Emancipation Proclamation? Why the 13th Amendment? Why the clear efforts of the radical Republicans and Lincoln at the helm to end slavery? Russian history is fascinating. Greetings, Dr. Who, What, Where. No, Lincoln didn't change his view. Lincoln always had the same view. Slavery is bad. But I don't think he felt that he could end slavery. I think he came to realize that he could end slavery, and if he could end slavery, he would. He also said, everybody quotes if I could free the Union, if I could end slavery, if I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do that. But he also said, if I could save the Union and free slaves, then I would. If I could free some of them and leave some of them behind while saving the Union, I would do that as well. He didn't see that in the cards. That doesn't mean he was against it. Lincoln, this is such a misrepresentation of who Lincoln was. It is such a misrepresentation of the Republican Party at the time. It's this idea that you had to be an abolitionist. No, abolitionism was the radical, crazy Antifa of its day, or the radical MAGA America First of its day, if you will. It was the extreme version. Nobody thought it had any way of happening. And it really was extreme because 700,000 men had to die in order for it to actually be achieved. Think about it that way. Which Russians were the most safe during this period? You mentioned the post. A lot of the apparatchiks in the Communist Party, loyal Bolsheviks, although Stalin would later deal with them. Many of the Russian royal family, their extended family, were able to flee. Many Russian nobles were able to flee. The upper class were able to flee out of the country. A large number of the whites and their families and their armies were actually able to flee to Turkey before the Red Army closed in and did horrible things to the survivors. What was the preceding state of the Russian Empire of the Rus? Well, the Russian Empire, it really depends what you mean by the Russian Empire. I've done several lectures on this EDG, but the Russian Empire starts with Peter the Great in 1722. If you mean the Tsardom of Russia, which the Russian word for Caesar is Tsar, the Russian Tsardom really starts in 1547 under Ivan the Terrible, or Ivan Dracul, or sorry, no, it's Vlad Dracul, Ivan Grozny, aka Awesome, Dreadful, or Terrible. He's the first one to call himself Tsar, although his grandfather occasionally called himself Tsar. Tsar is the Russian word for Caesar, so if you want to say the Russian Empire starts in 1547, you could. Muscovy was what it was called. It was a princedom that was under the yoke of the Mongols and the Tatars, and eventually freed themselves from the Golden Horde in 1480, like I talked about earlier. The Rus was the original state. Go and watch my series on Russian history. I get into all of this in great detail. Who exactly are the Samaritans in ancient Israel, and why did the Hebrews dislike them? So the Samaritans, according to the New Testament, are considered to be enemies. Let's just go with the biblical account, not because it's necessarily historical, but because it gives us the picture. According to the Bible, according to the book of Kings, Solomon dies, the son of David dies, and he's the one who builds the temple. And when he dies, the kingdom is divided between his son and another man named Jeroboam. Jeroboam establishes a northern kingdom. The northern kingdom is called Israel, and its capital is in Samaria. And they are seen as the wicked, evil ones by the books of the kings and stuff like that, that every king did evil, whatever that means. And so the southern kingdom lasts longer and is conquered by the Babylonians. The Jews interpreting these events between the crossroads of Egypt and the Assyrian and Egyptian wars, and later the Babylonians conquering Assyria under Nebuchadnezzar the Great, look at it as we did evil, God punished us, we lost our land, and our temple was destroyed. So this was God's punishment because we turned on him and were syncretic polytheists or bitheists like most people were at the time. Syncretism was common in the ancient Israel kingdoms of Judah and Israel. I know it's confusing, but Israel's the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom is Judah. Both of them are eventually conquered by these much larger empires. When some of the people return to and live in that land, they live in Samaria and develop their own culture that is different than the Jews, and they do not worship the God of the Old Testament the same way the Jews are. They reject the second temple, and they are known as the Samaritans. And in fact, they actually were not exiled. A large number of the Jews were taken off into slavery and captivity in Babylon and Persia, but a large number of them were able to remain in the land, and these people eventually become the Samaritans, and they deny the efficacy of sacrifice, of a sacrificial worship system of the Second Temple. They deny the supremacy of the new priesthood that's developed when the Second Temple is rebuilt in the late 6th century BC, so about 515. I remember the earlier decades when you're going backwards, so that's the late part of the 6th century. And these people are around at the time of Jesus and afterwards. There's even a few of them still around today, and they are considered to be unclean because they are traitors in the Jewish mind of the time of Jesus and before then. Do you think I could get an American history degree like how you got it? Of course you can. It's total. If you want it, you can get it. Can you recommend a good starter book about Lincoln? Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about him. What's his name? Meacham. Meacham wrote a really good book about Lincoln. My name's a protected building in the U.S. He owned a cotton field, was well respected, and freed his slaves. Interesting. What's the distinction between a czar and an emperor? Or are they roughly the same, and what constitutes an empire? Well, the Russian Empire, Peter the Great is tired of the old Muscovite tradition of looking at the Tsar as the emperor, and because he's modernized and changed the bureaucracy and absorbed even more power for himself, as Russia really gets on its road towards absolutism, he basically decides that Russia should be an empire, just like the Holy Roman Empire, the Austrians, and the British. So in 1722, after defeating the Swedish in the Great Northern War, he declares Russia an empire. Well, he believed that the war was to preserve the Union, but if that meant but Lincoln also wanted to free the slaves. But then he put freeing the slaves at the forefront of his efforts. He realized he could do both. Roosevelt and Truman defeated Japan and Germany with fewer deaths than Lincoln's war. Oh, for God's sakes, that is such nonsense. Fewer Americans died, but how many? But that is absurdity. That is just, well, looking at the amount of American deaths, only 400,000 died in the last World War, World War III, because there's been 3 of them, and Lincoln caused many more deaths. It's Lincoln who caused it. Jefferson Davis had nothing to do with it. The rebel Confederates had nothing to do with it. That's absurdness. I mean, this is madness. We have to destroy Abraham Lincoln? I'm sorry. But if you actually look at history, and you look at how many Japanese, hundreds of thousands of Japanese died as a result of the bombs, let alone the battles at Okinawa and Iwo Jima. When you consider the fact that the Union invaded the Confederacy and many of the casualties in the Civil War, at least half of them, are Confederates, then yes, more Americans died in that war, but I don't even look at it that way because I don't see the Civil War as a war between Americans. I see the Civil War as the war between the Union and the Confederacy. The U.S. won the war by destroying a rebel enemy, the Confederacy. It is an insurgency. So, no, I do not accept that. You are conflating the Allied, and you are saying there's only just these amount of Americans who died in this World War, but so many more Americans died in the Civil War. Yeah, technically, 80,000 people. And then that's not to mention the firebombings. What would you like to get? Beginning Russian history masters? Yeah, you would have to get a bachelor's in thesis class. You would write your thesis on your topic. You would need to get it approved, and you would need to write a 70-page opus magnum. Any single topic, and he won't stop. I have facts that present. They don't even make a cohesive argument. Exactly what people do when they come on here and try to make everything about the Jews. Russia did 1 year war. Harsh war, video about the Roman kings, and put I'm sorry, but I'm just trying to destroy everything. Now, yeah, and there's a lot of other historians who would agree with me that 7 years' questions, topics, comments, things you'd like to discuss about history of social studies, I'd be happy to discuss them with you. I'm happy to have you all here. Hopefully you're having a really, really good weekend. And how's this checking out so far? Just wanting to double check that. Okay, now I'm finally getting the feed. Okay, what was the last thing you heard me said? What was the last thing you heard me say? Well, the Russian history, you would have to study, you would have to take several master's classes on different historical topics, and eventually you would write your master's, a large paper full of primary sources mainly, on a topic of American history, and you'd have to develop a thesis and be ready to argue it. Yeah, World War II or World War III, which I think World War II is World War III because of the 7 Years' War, so. Do you think the American deaths should be ignored by the American president? No, but they're not Americans. They're Confederates. They were operating in rebellion to the United States government. And I mean, I absolutely think this is absolutely absurdly stupid. This is like saying Truman is that this is the same argumentation that says, oh, we should, this is Tucker Carlson and the nonsensical argument he makes that we should just acknowledge that civilian deaths are bad and that you can't do that. And I'm like, well, yeah, everybody acknowledges that, but what man should do and what man ought to do are two different things. It's this simplistic lack of categories that we deal with in a historical topic. I'm sorry, but the truth of the matter is Lincoln's life was horrifyingly mangled by the Civil War. Lincoln never slept properly because of it. The weight of it crashed onto him heavier than any other figure. So FDR is responsible for the 417,000 American deaths during the last World War, and Truman? This is so stupid. What is Executive Order 11246? I don't even know what it is. What do you think about Mike Huckabee's statements on Tucker Carlson? Also, will the war against Iran, Israel turn the U.S. into an empire to a weak country like Britain? No. According to Lincoln, Confederates were American. Well, I disagree with him. I mean, they were American by race and ethnicity, but they were not. They were fighting a war against the United States. I mean, categories. They were fighting a war, so of course there's going to be casualties. What are they supposed to do? Just continue to practice slavery? Was that what was supposed to happen? Because slavery wouldn't have ended without a war at that point. I'm sorry, but it's obvious. It was so deeply entrenched in their society that getting rid of it properly made no sense. And if you don't think that, then explain to me why the secession happened. Why did they leave the Union as soon as Lincoln got elected? They left the Union because they thought Lincoln was going to take away their slaves, even though he said he wouldn't. They started it, not Lincoln. Lincoln finished it. This is like you getting mad at a dad for stopping a fight with his kid. He believed they were rebels who deserved to be punished and fight a war over it, and that means people die. Soldiers die. Lincoln also believed in granting favorable terms to the South. He didn't want to punish them heavily, but obviously the punishment for fighting in a war is the risk that you will die. Why do we no longer, this is the Tucker Carlson thing, we no longer think in these guys, oh, a lot of people died, so it's bad. Yeah, it's bad. War is bad. War is terrible. War is devastating. Everybody since Plato knew this. Confucius and Sun Tzu knew it. Everyone knows war is bad. Everybody hates war. Everybody with a moral compass and logic knows that war is bad. But everybody who thinks critically also realizes that it is sometimes necessary. And that also means that a lot of people die. Some of them are civilians. Hopefully very few of them are civilians. But unfortunately, these things happen. If the Confederates weren't Americans, then the war shouldn't have been confused. On what grounds? On what basis are you going with that? That doesn't make any sense. The U.S. punished their rebels. They were American by ethnicity, and they had left the Union. Lincoln was going to put them back in the Union. And maybe that didn't mean freeing the slaves, but eventually he realized, yeah, it means freeing the slaves. I can do two things at once because I'm the president of the United States. War is ingrained in human nature. Absolutely. Humans are going to fight wars. I'm sorry, but anyone who just says, oh, well, if we could just say that war is bad and innocent. I mean, I'm listening to Tucker Carlson being interviewed and talking about war is like watching a 3-year-old talk. Somebody who thinks he's a brilliant intellectual and a voice for the West doesn't understand that there would be no West without war. I'm sorry, but you just can't go and kill people. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, you can. That's what war is. And sometimes war involves killing lots of people to stop greater evils. Do you think the Nazis would have stopped killing Jews? Do you think the Japanese would have stopped, I can't use the word, to what they did to the Chinese women? To the point of dying? Do you think that the Kaiser would have just, well, they don't want to fight a war, so I'll just do nothing? Does anyone think, how did you're an American, you're talking about American history. How did America get started? It did get started with a Tea Party. He believed the Confederate States were rebels who needed to be punished and then restored to the United States. Manchuria was horrendous. What they did in Nanjing was horrendous. What they did at Bataan was horrendous. But all people like Tucker Carlson care about is America used bombs on them that were bad. Yes, it was bad. It was horrific. And the cataclysm of it is because of the technology that was used. But then you virtue signal about it when I just don't understand what the right wing thinks it is anymore. Because the right wing for the longest time was, yeah, America, go, go, go. Yeah, I mean, it was bad, but we had to do it. And now that's not what the right wing is anymore. Roman emperors were kinder. No, Roman emperors weren't kinder. Exactly. Go back through all of history. Civilian casualties? Who cares? Let me see here. Less Americans died in all those other wars. Less Americans died. Americans. But America was fighting a war, with itself. So in the Russian Civil War, Russians killed Russians, yes, but it was whites versus reds. In the American Civil War, you have Confederates, which formed a rebel nation. That nation is destroyed and punished and because of that, then you can say, well, technically more Americans died. More Americans died because it was Americans versus other Americans. But there were far more casualties of the enemy, of the belligerents in both world wars against the Americans than in that one. Or in the First World War. Well, no, I don't know about that actually. Actually, that's not true. That's wrong. Steve doesn't deserve to be timed out. I don't think he should be timed out, but I don't even know. He was actually starting to make an argument. I just don't understand the argumentation. And I don't understand the argumentation because people who think they love history just don't understand that this is the way the world works. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. But I hate the phrase, well, if people just did this, then this would be a horrible place. It is a horrible place. Who's Jonathan Pollard? Imagine how many humans there would be without war. There are plenty of people who have theorized that war is the great eliminator, is how we reduce populations, that it is more than it is just rich and powerful people playing with their toy armies. This is a Marxist interpretation for population control. And there is some evidence to say that actually is true. So, the Black Plague. Spanish flu that wasn't war. Well, the Black Plague is not the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu is a different thing, and it really didn't even start in Spain. I could talk about both of them, El Chicano, if you want me to. It's good to see you, by the way. Let me see. Other stuff. Let's talk about some other stuff. Harse. Put the Abraham Lincoln video in the chat so people can learn about the Civil War. Put the Roman kings so people can learn about Rome before the Caesars. And put the video on the 7 Years' War so people can understand that I believe the 7 Years' War is World War I. Okay, so the Black Plague is a derivative of the bubonic plague, a particular virulent strain that would happen before and after, but was at its peak between 1347 and 1351 in Europe. It arrives in Venice, brought by fleas, probably hid in the fur of rats. The microbes obviously carried by the fleas. And that led to the deaths of about 50 million people. A third to a half of Europe's population is destroyed over the next 4 years. Very few people who get the plague actually survive. Some areas are just completely depopulated. The rich and powerful hide away. Prince Prospero in the story of The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe is an example of this. These are all stories. It changes European society forever because what it does is it forces the Europeans. European labor becomes much more valuable, especially menial labor. Serfdom is ended. Basically, the entire social stratum is started to change. Cities are depopulated, so all of a sudden countries are smaller, and you have more people living in certain areas. You can say that one of the biggest causes of the Renaissance is indeed the leveling of a playing field by the Black Death, where all of a sudden labor and creation of resources and goods is particularly has much more value than it did before, and you can't just force people to do it like you have for centuries before then. All of a sudden you have a little bit more, you have a flaking away of the old feudal system and the creation of social mobility, particularly in Italy, which is hurt worse by it, and you have the need to fill the void by developing better markets, and eventually from this you get the Medicis in Florence and the Casavos in Savonarolas in Milan. The dancing plague was a disease that would cause people to have seizures that would basically be like dancing. The Spanish flu, El Chicano, is first reported by the Spanish in 1918. Because they're not fighting in the World War at the time, they don't have to report on it the way the Europeans do. And so there's a completely different expectation. The Europeans don't report on it because they're censoring their presses and they're focusing only on the war. But it most likely developed from the trenches. It kills millions of people, and it is extremely disastrous. I think 50,000 Americans die, and it lasts about a year. And it's compared often to the COVID pandemic. Oh yeah, that's where the saying witch comes from. Yeah, there was also, during the Black Death, there was a lot of persecution of witches, people who they believe were witches. Jews were heavily persecuted. Anyone who could be blamed for it was blamed for it. Watch my video on Lincoln, watch my video on the Roman Kings, watch my video on the 7 Years' War. You can learn a lot about history, and that'll only take about 20 minutes. Liking and subscribing will be very helpful to this live stream. Liking those videos and making a comment helps the algorithm. Leaving a comment helps the algorithm, so I really, really appreciate all of that. And Steve, go watch the video on Abraham Lincoln before you engage with me again. Yes, it did affect Asia and Africa. After it left Europe, it goes to Russia and then to China and devastates the Ming Dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty. It's one of the reasons the Yuan collapse. Google says 675,000 deaths in U.S. from Spanish flu, more than World War I. Yeah, that's right, 675,000. Well, 100,000 men die in that war. Which I guess that's the only casualties that matter in war. We learned today that the only casualties that matter are American ethnic casualties. It doesn't matter if America's fighting against itself or another country. But yeah, you're welcome, Edward. You don't have to yell that, but I appreciate you saying that. Abe Lincoln was a 6'5" fist fighter. Yes, which means he was violent and evil, according to some people. Can we blame Lincoln for his horrific general lineup? Yes. Lincoln is not perfect. I'm just not a Lincoln apologist. Habeas corpus was a mistake. Lincoln totally mismanages the first part of the war, particularly in the Potomac. If Lincoln had gotten Lee like he had wanted, the war would have been over in a month. Because Lee's just such a great general. Whatever you think of Robert E. Lee and statues and his memory, and of course fighting for a losing side that supported and defended slavery, Lee himself owned slaves. It is very, very true that Robert E. Lee is a extremely effective general. And Lincoln probably would have won the war. But he didn't get him. He got Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott was old and fat and didn't care. Then he gets McClellan, who just pussyfoots around the entire issue. Then you get people like Ambrose Burnside, who is the inspiration for sideburns, and all these other guys, and they really don't get anywhere. Yeah, Lincoln is fascinating. He's a fascinating guy. I have so many videos on Lincoln on the channel. Can you now say that I'm not a jingoist? No, I sound like a jingoist the way I defended Lincoln, so yeah. Have you seen History Undone's video on Lee, if he joined the North and they might have actually lost because the South would have fought more defensively? Interesting. Yeah, but I just don't see that happening because Grant devastates the West. The Confederacy is already divided, so maybe a year. But Lee fighting at Bull Run, I don't know. The brilliance of Robert E. Lee, the ability to just piece away the Union Army at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg,
The guy was pretty brilliant at what he did. And I think the South owes much of its pride in that war to Robert E. Lee. Do you think epidemics have collapsed more cultures than it gets credit for? I've heard of a Bronze Age collapse might have been caused by a plague. Sure. I mean, Justinian's rebuilding of the Western Roman Empire was stopped by the bubonic plague. You could argue that the medieval feudal system is destroyed by the Black Plague. That definitely changes national politics. Italy is completely reshaped afterwards into what it becomes in the Renaissance. You don't have Renaissance Italy without the plague. I believe the United States was a repentant nation. Also, me and you with the same view on Lincoln doesn't sound like a jingoist. He had facts and reasoning. Jingoists aren't equal. We were. True. Can you mention the similarities between MAGA movement and the Know-Nothings of the 1830s? Interesting. So the Know-Nothings were before the 1830s, and they actually ran a pretty formidable presidential campaign in 1856 with Millard Fillmore, who had been president before, at the top of the ticket. They were jokingly called the Know-Nothings, not because they were ignorant, but because they would say they had secret meetings, and they would say that they knew nothing about it. So they were the Know-Nothings. They called themselves the American Party. They were really an independent third party at the start of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party already being strong and powerful. The American Know-Nothing Party was basically the party that was not focused on the issue of slavery like everybody else was in the 1850s. They didn't think that was a big issue. Their focus was on nativism. They believed that immigration, large number of immigrants, many of them Catholics, some of them Jews, were a problem in America and would continue to be a problem unless it was addressed immediately. So they proposed mass immigration restriction. They basically justified persecution of different immigrant groups, and they wanted America to basically have almost no immigration and quota systems in the 1850s and 60s, which is before the great wave of immigration that starts in the 1880s, where you see Greeks, Jews, Polish, Russians, Italians coming in the largest numbers ever. This was immigration. They hated immigrants from places like Germany, Scandinavia, and Ireland. And they made the argument they hated Catholicism coming from German and Irish immigrants. So there was a lot of religious bigotry and prejudice because of it, too. I knew we had our disagreements, but man, this dude is great. You learned so much at the same time. Kudos. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Basically, their thesis is that Lee lost the war by going north. Also, he would have kept the best generals around him, and the Union would have not had the same success. That's true. Gettysburg is the turning point. I think there's a chance Achilles was a real person. Maybe an inspiration for Achilles is from a real person. I mean, they used to think that Troy wasn't real, and then Schliemann proved them. Was it Schliemann? Heilmann? He was a German guy. He proved that Troy was real in the 19th century. So since I believe the United States had problems but repented of them throughout history, can you drop the insult that I'm an American jingoist? No, not necessarily. I don't think you're an American jingoist, but I do think that there is a tendency on your end to just glaze America, and I like America. I live in America. I think there's a lot to be proud of in American history, but I think there's also a lot to be ashamed of, and my job as a historian is to tell the truth, not to glaze a country. Judaism and Zionism are two different things. Watch the documentary No Other Land. Everybody hates the other immigrant, even though they were immigrants one time. Does this have anything to do with history? I mean, other than the fact that all the early Zionists were Jews, Judaism, so I'm just going to explain this real fast so that we can just get this over with, because I've already had one argument. I don't want to have one long debate about Israel-Palestine, but I'm going to say this. Judaism is the religious system of the ethnic people, the Jews. Okay, Dave Chappelle says never begin or end a statement with the Jews. The Jews are an ethnic people. The religion is Judaism. There are Jews who practice Judaism who are not Zionists. In fact, even some of the most strident Orthodox groups are anti-Zionist because they believe Israel has been spiritualized and cannot actually be a physical place anymore for them. That is not their homeland. That is a spiritual Israel. Some of the Haredi Jews believe that. And of course, super liberal Jews, Reform Reconstructionists, may be opposed to Israel in some way, shape, or form. Judaism is a religion. Jews are the ethnic group that represents that religion. The ancient Hebrews is what they were called. And Zionism is the belief. Zionism is the belief that the Jews deserve their own state. It's a form of Jewish nationalism. The 19th century is full of nationalism. Some of it is Jewish and some of it isn't. And Zionism is one example of that. So now that I've actually educated you, let's move on. The Roman Empire reached Scandinavia because they were stopped by the German barbarians and couldn't advance, or was Scandinavia not a target? They knew about it, but not a big target. They never could conquer the Germans. After the Teutoburg Forest, it was proven that they weren't ever going to get there. How do I glaze the United States? That would be, I presume I don't use facts and reasoning. I don't think we should be ashamed of repentance. No, you can glaze something with facts and reasoning. Look at your opinion on the War of 1812. That's total glaze. Saying everyone is an immigrant is false. People are immigrants, settlers, all sorts of different things. Let me see. Anybody can be Jew or Jewish from Judaism. Human beings arrived first on the planet, and then they created religion and spiritually out of their existence, not the other way around. Judaism is the religion. Jews are the people who practice that religion. It is not that hard to believe. There are Jews who are not religious and do not practice Judaism, and there are Gentiles who practice Judaism or follow the Noahide laws prescribed by Orthodox Jews, for instance. I'm doing well. I hope you're doing well too, dead boy. How is anything talking about Jewish hate? If that doesn't even make sense, everybody gets called out. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or whoever. I just love how people who are constantly obsessed with criticizing Jews in Israel constantly play the victim. Constantly, if we say anything, then that's bad. No, you said plenty, and I disagree with it, and I showed you why you were wrong, and you just continue to go on about it. What's the ethnicity of Jews? Jewish. Jewish is the ethnicity. And there's different iterations of that ethnicity in different areas of the world. And it'd be easier to pin down if you think there's a problem and Jews aren't Jews. Well, then think about this. Ethnicity has a huge tie to homeland and national identity. Germans are from Germany. Italians are from Italy. Chinese are from China. It's harder to pin that down for the Jews, and there's different iterations of Jewish ethnic identity because they didn't have a homeland for thousands of years. And this is a history channel, so I'm going to talk about it historically. There are Sephardic, Mizrahim, and Ashkenazi Jews, historically speaking. What empires would win if it was the same time line, the Mongolian or the Roman? Ooh, the Mongols. I don't think the Romans have an answer for cavalry. They couldn't defeat the Parthians. And for cavalry, for horse archery, they couldn't defeat the Parthians, and the Mongols were just a better form of that. So what's Jewish ethnicity? Is it white? Is it black? Using those terms. That's racial. That's like asking, are the Arabs white? Are Arabs white? That there's different categories. It's not a dichotomy of white or black. Physically speaking, Jews can appear in many different forms. Some Jews are more European looking. Some Jews are darker, almost brown or black. There are Jews in Ethiopia who are black skinned that have an ethnic tie to the ancient Jews genetically. The reason it's a different category is because the Jews were spread all over the world because of the diasporas. Same way, and if anyone could relate to this, it's actually black people, because Africans were diasporaed to North and South America. But the blacks who live in Canada and the United States have a very different identity than the Jamaicans, the Haitians, and the black Brazilians, or the mulattoes in Central America. I love how people who constantly complain about race and religion, they create their own loop. Yes. Can you briefly explain the interesting story of the Czech division raining havoc in Siberia during the Russian Civil War? Yeah, they were like the frontline A1 elite fighting forces of Kolchak's army in the east fighting against the Red Army. And actually, I was talking about this extensively with the Russian Civil War. The Red Army actually gets close to winning the war. The White Army gets close to winning the war. It's just they were never unified enough or worked together enough, and they were very, very good at mistreating and abusing people, and that's why they never were able to get there. So, yeah. Can you talk about how Israel and the CIA created Iran into a superpower during the Iran-Contra in the 1980s? No, I can't talk about that because it didn't happen. Iran was already a superpower. Iran was already a radical Islamic country at that time, and Iran already hated the Jews. The CIA used weapons, bought weapons from the Middle East, from Iran in particular, through an Arab weapons dealer who knew and worked with Jeffrey Epstein, was friends with Jeffrey Epstein. And that might have been the link to the CIA in order to bolster the work of the Contras. The Contras were a right-wing counter-revolutionary group in Nicaragua opposing Daniel Ortega's Sandinistas, the communists. Because it's the middle of the Cold War, you're going to oppose communism at any means necessary. It's a big blunder in American geopolitical relations. It's a terrible stain on the Reagan legacy. But they bought weapons from the Contras in Iran and used that to help from the Iranians to help the Contras. This is when they were also giving weapons to Saddam Hussein to fight against the Iranians. This was only a few years after the Iranian hostage crisis, when Iran was clearly detrimentally opposed to the United States. Samurai were extremely efficient. Let me see. What is even actually considered white? Like, are French or Slavs or Finns white? Are there like multiple ethnicities in Europe? Where does the line go, since it's not entirely based just on color? Yeah, it's a tough one, Captain Treasure, because we don't know for sure, but white obviously refers to skin color. It also refers to European ancestry. So whoever is considered Caucasian, Indo-Aryan, Caucasian, people who from the Caucasus Mountains spread and delineated their culture over Europe, who have ancient barbaric ancestry that challenged the Romans, or who were the Romans themselves, are considered to be white. So for the longest time in the United States, Hispanics were considered to be white because they were half Spanish, or at least half Spanish, or the result of the Spanish conquest and oppression and intermarrying with the native peoples of Central and South America. At the same time, the Italians were not considered white. The Jews were certainly not considered white. White Europeans, white people, were Angloid. Not even Irish at first were considered white. This is a category that was extended further when you consider the fact that French, Germans, Americans, English, they definitely are generally light-skinned. Look at me. You don't know my ethnicity. You can guess my ethnicity, but you could extend it to the Spanish, and you can extend it to the Greeks, and you can extend it to everybody from the continent of Europe. You can even extend it to the Russians and say they're white. And that means the people that are not from Europe are not white. So it's really kind of a catch-all for people on the European continent who have a history with the European continent. But it's not easy to do, Captain Treasure, not at all. What warrior was the most efficient in your opinion? Viking, samurai, Roman soldier? The samurai. Trained in the code of Bushido, extremely eclectic, excellent warrior, knew how to fight, and was usually responsible for commanding different units. We think of the samurai as an individual warrior, but he's actually more of a commander, more of a captain or a general. Canada became a country because of a potential hostile America. Is the threat of America to Canada still a good reason to maintain confederation? No. Well, there's approximately now 35,000 Jews in Iran that live free and are not having any issues. And hi, Mr. Michael. Kind of. Not having any issues is interesting. If you ever want to talk to someone, let me know. Excuse me, and I won't punish them, but you need to let me know. Yeah, I would rather people speak and reveal themselves to be fools than for them to hide it. And I believe in ultimate free speech. Nicaragua is super scary right now, and nobody is talking about it. Nicaragua currently is the largest police state in Latin American history. It's historic and crazy how bad Nicaragua is right now. Well, everybody's talking about Malay. They're talking about Bukele and all of these people. They're talking about Steinbaum standing up to Trump. They're talking about the Mexican cartels. But yeah, nobody talks about Nicaragua. Are the Sandinistas still in control? Is Ortega still in power? I know he's still alive. Are you Kylo Ren? No, I'm Patrick. Who were the U.S. troops sent to Siberia in World War II or World War III? I think their nickname were the Polar Bears. Yeah, they were sent there to basically help the Soviets. There was the hope that the Soviets would eventually help them fight against the Japanese. There were Americans sent there during the Great War as well to keep the Russians in the war, and they actually helped the whites. Let me see. I have not heard anything lately about Nicaragua. We'll definitely check that out. I'd imagine El Salvador would be more of a police state. I know they're cracking down hard on gangs. They are. They're interesting right now. How do you feel about the State Department supporting Albertan separatists? I don't know enough about it, and if you want me to talk about political thing, give me a super chat. I will say that the idea of America annexing parts of Canada, taking over Greenland, things like this that sound just like loony Donald Trump are actually pretty historically American. The Americans try to invade Canada twice. They try to get Canada out of the British clutches in both the American Revolution and in the War of 1812. Failed both times. The settlement, American settlers, pioneers, and fur trappers were trading and living in British Columbia into the 1840s. The Americans threatened war with Great Britain. There was the 54-40 or fight. There was this idea of getting to the 54th parallel, which means British Columbia would have belonged to the United States. Eventually they stood on the 49th parallel, but the Americans wanted to control all of the Pacific Northwest, not just Oregon and Washington. So the real truth of the matter is that the United States has had designs on Canada for a very long time, and the hegemonic influence of the post-war consensus is breaking apart. So because of that, the United States feels more of a tension and urge to want to control it now. There's been people talking about innocent people being targeted as well. Sure. He believes in ultimate free speech. That means moderator, don't time me out. No, hold on a second. You don't get to go on the channel and just insult me, troll, say the same thing over and over again, bring up repeated arguments. There are things that can get you cut off and banned. What I believe in ultimate free speech is I believe people have a right to bring up anything they want to on this channel, and I will talk about it. If it's not something that I normally talk about that's not pertinent to the channel, I'm going to insist that you give me a super chat, which would really, really helpful, but no pressure to do that. And if you don't want to do that, go about your day, enjoy the channel, like and subscribe, check out all of the content that we have, and consider asking me a question about something else. How did mammoth hunters take down saber-tooth tigers and mammoths with sticks? Big game hunting is huge in the Mesolithic era. There's the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic era, and we don't talk about it, but the Mesolithic era lasted about 100,000 years and includes, or 50,000 years, and includes a lot of big game hunting. And basically you would have parties of men who would go out and hunt for long periods of time, and it was basically kill or be killed at that point. I don't know a lot more about it. We don't actually know a lot more about it, but you have pelts, you have furs, you have tents, you have habitation, you have food, you have weapons from the saber-tooths that you can use now. So no part of the animal would go unpunished. I guess the closest comparison you can draw from more modern experiences are how the Native Americans would utilize every single part of the animal that they killed in many places. Some of them were so in depth with nature that they would thank the animal for their spear, for their food, the spirit of the animal for their food and for their clothing that they would get. Interesting. I will have to look into what Nicaragua is doing. Sounds kind of scary. Let me see here. Why do you think China never tried to colonize the North American West Coast? I believe they knew it was there, correct? They didn't know it was there, but they thought there might be something. They had already, through the treasure fleets of Zheng He, gone around the South China Sea and large sections of Polynesia and exacted tribute. They ended up choosing not to do this in what became known when the Ming Dynasty changed its apparatus after 1433. Okay, let's just calm down and move on, Mr. Bill and Harry. Yeah, Hars, why are we doing this? Why are we even talking about that? He's not abusing his moderator powers. He's doing a good job. So he's just trying to protect the channel from trolls and from just going off topic into stuff that we don't need to talk about here. Anyways, what else do we want to talk about? What history do we want to discuss? Can you see the feed all right? And am I coming in clear? Hopefully it's a yes for both of those things. What do you mean glaze? I'm saying praise without quarter. Okay, good. I'm glad I'm good. Fortunately, we haven't had that many problems with the feed recently. Did the Greeks have homosexuality in their soldier cult? Yeah. I don't even know how much homosexuality is really in there. There's definitely a lot of bisexuality and definitely monogamy is not the case. Polyamory and polygamy are definitely on the table for the Greeks. How long did the Greenland colony of the Vikings last? Several hundred years. We can talk a little bit about King Solomon. So King Solomon is supposedly the Jewish king who builds the temple. He's the son of King David. According to the Bible, he writes the wisdom literature of the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon. We don't know about that. What we do know is there was a Davidic kingdom. There was a kingdom that was attributed to a man named David, and David's son supposedly built the Jewish temple. Building the Jewish temple centralized worship. And supposedly, like I said, one of the two kingdoms in the area, the kingdom of Judah, is descended from Solomon. Does ethnicity or religion come with that? I'm trying to clarify here so I know what to talk about. Well, you can, if you want me to talk about a religious doctrine, dogma, or idea, give me a super chat and I'll talk about it in a historical context, but I'm not going to make it a religion discussion. If you want to ask me about ethnic questions, I'm going to answer them historically. Praise without quarter means you don't make explanations, you don't explain, yeah, the U.S. ended slaves, but it cost hundreds of thousands of lives. That would be an example of it. You need to be more critical in the way you look at American history. So yes. I mean, I'm open to talking about ethnicity in terms of history. I already answered the questions about about Jewish ethnic heritage and Jewish ethnic history, and I've answered several questions about Jewish history today, and I've actually enjoyed that. I'm talking about the history of the Hebrews, the Essenes, the Qumran communities, discussing King David, some of the biblical accounts, the arguments about the Exodus. I enjoy discussing that, not because I'm just super Jewish, like some people seem to think on this channel, but because it's historical. I'm not going to just get into a bogged down debate about what is happening in Palestine without referring to the history. Yeah, a big shout out to the Russian brothers on the front. If you want to learn more about the Russian brothers on the front, Serbia, may I suggest you check out all of my videos on Russian history. Hars, can you put the video on the Russian Revolution in the chat? The feed problems and energy weapons attacks only happens when I come into the chat, then the Mossad start to jam the feed. Yeah, Mossad doesn't care about me. Mossad would not care about me. And even if I talked about how Jews are evil and they cause all the world's problems, Mossad would still not care about me because guess what? There's lots of people on the internet who do this and they never have any problems. Thank you for enjoying the live. Why was the Sinai Peninsula never very populated? Many cities in the Levant and obviously Egypt, but I can't recall many in the Sinai. Deserty, lack of access to water. You also have it as a crossroads. It's easily invadable. It's a bulwark. It's supposed to be like any area, a desert or mountain range, that's between different areas across a place of defense, where you have to go through it before you can reach the Egyptians. Can you talk about the history, current Jews in Jerusalem and the ghetto that existed pre-1948, and they are against the state of Israel? Are you familiar with them? Yeah, there's Jews who think that. I mean, I was talking about the Haredi Jews who believe that Israel is a spiritual notion and not an actual country. And so they don't believe in the state of Israel. Yeah, there are Jews who are against the state of Israel. Thank you, Starlight. I really appreciate that. Are they still saying you're funded by AIPAC? A lot of people think that I'm funded by AIPAC, even though I'm clearly not. I have nothing to do with AIPAC. But if you look at the background, like my profile picture, it's the AIPAC tracker, which Hars turned into a what is it called? An AI thing, where I'm in the background and you can see me, and yeah, because Jews bad. Why Jews get kicked out of 100 plus countries? Why are we doing this? Why did Jews get kicked out of 100 plus countries? So this is something that anti-Semites and anti-Zionists, which are different categories. Notice how you can't play the persecuted game with me. You can't play the, oh, well, the Jews control everything, and because of that, I'm being silenced. And see, anytime anyone says anything bad about Israel, people lose their minds. No, that's nonsense. Especially, at least here, it's nonsense. I don't go through that nonsense. Bend over. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm not answering it soon enough for you. Yeah, Jews and you can be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic, but it's hard to be in some cases. Depends how your argumentation is and where you're going. The problem that anti-Semites have when they make this argument is twofold. One, the argument is the Jews are bad, therefore they've been kicked out of 100 plus countries. When one of the major reasons for them being kicked out of these countries is anti-Semitism. In many cases, anti-Semitism. Why were they kicked out of Spain? Persecution from the Spanish monarchy. Catholics who hated Jews, and that's why the Inquisition's happening at the same time, to root out Jews. So persecution of Jews is heavy at that time. You also have the fact that you have Jews, they were kicked out of all the Muslim countries after the 48 War. The Poles, the French, the British, the Russians, they've all kicked out Jews, sometimes multiple times. You could consider the diasporas to be expulsions from the land of Israel. So the being kicked out of 100 is a broad brush statement, and a lot of the examples that are the second problem is a lot of the actual examples are directly because of anti-Semitic behaviors. You make this argument, oh, the Jews must be bad because they've been kicked out of all these countries. Well, the Jews don't have a homeland for most of their history, and the homeland and the countries they do move into are often hostile to them for many different reasons. Sometimes they won't assimilate. Sometimes it's they're disproportionately wealthy. Sometimes it's because they won't accept Christ. All of these different reasons that are not necessarily their fault, but just the fact that they retain and maintain their ancient culture and traditions has led to them being heavily persecuted. And if you don't think that happens to people because they refuse to assimilate, look at the Romani gypsies gypsies and how they've been treated, because they've experienced the exact same problem. The Druzes have experienced the same problem, and so have the Kurds, except they aren't as populous or widespread as the Jewish population throughout the world. So microcosms of this exist with how the Romani gypsies have been treated in Middle and Eastern Europe for the last several hundred years. And they were heavy targets of the Holocaust just as much as the Jews were. So the truth of the matter is the Jews being kicked out of these countries. Why? One of the reasons is anti-Semitism. And the reasons for that are complex and variegated. And I am sure there are instances where Jews did terrible things, and because of that, Jews were kicked out of this land. That's like saying there are some black people who do bad things, and because there are some black people who do bad things, black people should be kicked out of these lands. That's an extremely racist and nativist sentiment that would be applied to the Jews in that context. And what is racism towards Jews called? Anti-Semitism. Although anti-Semitism would refer to hatred of Arabs would be anti-Semitic, technically speaking. Hatred of the Lebanese people would be anti-Semitic, technically speaking. These people are different groups of Semites. But the main colloquial definition through the years of anti-Semitism is in reference to the Juda, to the Jews. So the truth of the matter is, the reason you are asking this question is probably an anti-Semitic reason, and that is also the very same reason that they've been kicked out of those countries. I actually don't mind being asked that question because it sheds light on how bad anti-Semitism actually is, and it is a self-defeating argument that you don't even know about. So, boom, there you go. Why aren't those talked about as much as the Holocaust? Because people don't want to, because the main target of the hatred of the Holocaust was the Jewish people. And we don't talk enough about the Poles and the communists and the others who were killed during the Holocaust. The Jewish people are not their government. Well, nobody knows that, and nobody seems to care. Let me see. Why emphasize anti-Semitism when Islamophobia killed 65,000 Palestinians since 2023? How unproductive. Is it Islamophobia that killed them? I don't know that is it bigotry against Japanese people and racism against Japanese that killed the Japanese? Or Hiroshima and Nagasaki because of racism? I don't know if that's necessarily true. That's a really, really, really bad idea. Hold on a second. I need to charge my battery because I'm at 1%. We've lasted long enough. We were going 2 hours because we missed yesterday's live stream. Usually we only go an hour. But I need to charge my phone, so give me a second. I am right here. Please take that time to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Okay, we are back. I don't have my microphone plugged in anymore, but I'm still here, ready to talk about history and social studies. The Acropolis, I don't know the story behind it. Are you talking about the Parthenon? Well, the Acropolis isn't the Parthenon. The Acropolis is a large mountain edifice that was built in order. Okay, what's happening with the feed? Okay, I've been trying to fix the feed. Okay, I think we're back here. So, all right, where were we? We were talking about a bunch of different things before I got kicked out. Let me see. I'm going to go back through the chat and catch up really fast. Everybody harps on the Holocaust, which is a horrible thing, but if you want to get down to the brass tacks, the African slave trade, the Indian Holocaust, there were millions more unalived. Yeah, there were many people who were unalived by both of those things, and people do talk about them a lot. I mean, a huge part of the complaint and frustration in the mistreatment of African Americans, and a huge part of what's called woke ideology, is a focus on the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery and the racism that developed from that. That is definitely talked about a lot. The mistreatment of the Indians by the British is talked about a lot. I wouldn't call it a Holocaust or a genocide that happened in India, but you do have the extraction of trillions of dollars of resources. You do have the Bengal famine, which is the closest thing you can come to a genocide, which is the reallocation of food and rations during a war by Churchill that leads to the deaths of about 3 to 5 million Indian people in the 1940s. Yes, these things are realities, and they're horrible realities, and they aren't talked about enough as enough. People don't know about it because it's not Western, okay?
The truth, but people know about the transatlantic slave trade. They know about the Europeans oppressing Africans. They don't know nearly anything about the Barbary pirates. If we want to go down this road of you don't know enough about this, well, you actually really don't know enough about this. The well is deep, and there's stuff I'm still learning about that I haven't heard about before. Why emphasize? Okay, let me see here. They get kicked out of because of their banking ways. I mean, there's some examples of that, but that's not the case. The Christians, when they go off to crusades, consider the Jews to be the infidels. So the Jews are heavily mistreated by the Catholics in Europe in the Middle Ages. It's just not even close. And there's Catholics today who wish it was like that again. They're nuts. I'm sorry, but this is actually massacres. Horrific treatment. It's not acceptable. You know, the problem I see with all of these people you have made, they made a correlation fallacy. Do you see that too? The anti-Semites, the neo-Nazis, the pro-Muslims. I don't know. I don't necessarily see that. Racism is not real. Yeah, racism is real. I'm the #1 abortion specialist for old world marsupial care. What are you talking about? iDubbbz, I think you need a brain scan. What about Henry Taft being the worst president? You mean William Howard Taft? Taft wasn't a bad president. He was just bullied by Theodore Roosevelt and wasn't able to go out on his own. Let me see. Who was America's worst president? I would say that it's James Buchanan. He allows the South to secede. He tries to force Kansas to accept slavery. He oversees the Dred Scott decision. He basically does nothing while his country falls apart in front of him and is the man who is directly responsible for the Civil War, not Abraham Lincoln. Let me see here. What else? Okay, why was Mac McLaren... Oh, for goodness, because he says what he always says about that. All right, let's see here. Can you do art history someday? Well, it all depends what kind of art history you want to talk about. If you want to talk about art history, ask me a question about it. Medieval art is really good. How is it not Islamophobia if even Ghislaine Maxwell wanted all Arabs exterminated by 2032 in her fantasy emails, and she's a hardcore Zionist, which includes hatred of Islam extremism of it too? Well, okay, extermination. Okay, so there are Islamophobic people who want to destroy all Muslims. There are anti-Semites who hate Arabs. There is bigotry towards Islam. Yes, that exists. That exists towards any religion. There is also the demonization, usually through propaganda, of the enemy. And you may not think this, but the biggest enemy to the Israelites, or to Israel, to the Israelis, not the Israelites, to Jews, are the Muslims, are the radical Muslims of the Middle East. Because guess what? They want to destroy them. They hate them, and maybe some of the Jews, some of the Israelis want to destroy them back. I'm not saying that's acceptable. I'm saying that makes total sense in the context of warfare. When you consider the most popular book in these areas of the world is indeed Mein Kampf, then you should know the battle you are fighting. So you can accuse the Israelis of being Islamophobic, but really most of them are not. There are more Muslims in Israel than there are Jews in any other Arab country or Middle Eastern country or Muslim country for that matter, other than Great Britain, which is a Muslim country. But the truth of the matter is there's lots of people who are hardcore Zionists who want to exterminate the Arabs, but that doesn't make the Israelis themselves Islamophobic. Some of them are, some of them aren't. I mean, again, there were plenty of people who felt the Japanese were inferior subhumans who should be all exterminated or put in camps, which they did to them. But that doesn't mean that they fought the war against the Japanese because they believe the Japanese were subhuman. They fought the war against the Japanese because the Japanese attacked them. Where did hummus come from historically, and how long has it been in use? That's a tough question, and it's very, very charged. Every single Middle Eastern society, the Greeks, the Turks, they want to take responsibility for the creation of hummus, and I don't know actually who did. How was Teddy Roosevelt perceived during his presidency? Were his programs like creating national parks and such popular? Extremely popular. Progressivism was kind of the in thing, and he was kind of a moderate progressive, not too extreme, and so he was extremely likable. And yeah, there's a difference between extremists and non-extremists. So we can easily say let's not blame all Muslims for acts of terrorism, which we absolutely shouldn't do. But at the same time, we don't do the same thing with extreme ultra-Zionists and the ultra-right wing in Israel. We start to say all Israelis and therefore and then eventually all Jews have this theory that Christians and Muslims are inferior and should be second-class citizens, when the vast majority of Jews do not believe that. Not even even Orthodox Jews believe that. It's absurdity. Who were Da Vinci's employers? The Medicis at times were patrons. The way the Renaissance worked is basically people would pay you, rich, powerful people would pay you to paint certain works or to sculpt something, or to research something or discover something or write something. So Machiavelli had patrons, Erasmus had patrons, Martin Luther even had patrons, so writers did it. Sculptors did it. Leonardo, Michelangelo, they were the church often patronized them. Yeah. And you would maybe in a sculpture, you would sculpt them, or you would paint them, or you would paint them into a religious scene. This was very common in the 16th and 17th centuries. Are me and Harry the newest mods? No, I thought Rodolfo became a mod after you. Oh no, Rodolfo was a mod before you. The newest mods? The newest mod is Beesnatch. What is the first documentation of the samurais? I don't know exactly when they were, but I mean, the medieval feudal system in Japan was alive and well or probably around the time of Christ. What do you think about Leonardo da Vinci? One of the greatest minds in all of history, a polymath, a great artist, scientist, inventor. What did the Romans use to build their roads? Concrete, brick, mortar, and ingenuity. The Romans were extremely efficient at building what they did, Snow Bear. How many people back then thought about 20-year time frames compared to only thinking about tomorrow? Ancient philosophers were talking about this stuff. This isn't as new as you think about thinking about the world in terms of long periods of time. Let me see. Have I answered all the questions? Because we're well over 2 hours. I said I would go 2 hours, and I have. And I think I've answered everything pretty fairly. I've done my best. Yep. Samurai system was feudal. How was a fort built in the New World? Like a star fort or something like that? Well, you would use wood most of the time. Do you know anything about Ya? Ya is in what? I don't know what you mean. Maybe you're telling a joke. I don't know. Whatever questions do we have? Because we're going to wrap up. I do my best. I try to be respectful. I don't always agree with your conclusions, Rooster, but I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad you're asking these questions, because these questions need to be asked. I don't suppress people just because they ask questions. I don't like anyone who does that. But as we learned earlier in the live stream, I also don't like these people who just decide to have first grade level critical thinking skills that they would never use when they're driving down the road, yet they apply it all the time to to much more complex situations like geopolitics and history. The creators? Oh, Yahweh. Well, Yahweh is the transliteration of the supposed holy name of God that the Jews cannot say, that the Christians do say, and the Christians identify Yahweh, which is based off of I am that I am, which God says to Moses, and the Christians think that's Jesus. Did you like Mel Brooks? I mean, who doesn't? He's hilarious. Do you want to own some of those stolen Napoleon artifacts? I want to own all of Napoleon's artifacts. Where did martial arts come from? I mean, you could say from the beginning of time, people learned how to defend themselves. Yeah, you also have, it's a blending of military, paramilitary activities along with commitments to Zen Buddhism, a commitment of these different philosophies to practice, Qi, Taoism, the balance, the yin and the yang, all of that stuff is heavily influential. Buddhism is heavily influential in karate. Who's the first culture that started using fairly advanced mathematics? The Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Indians. And the Muslims did a great amount of that contribution during their own golden age. Why do they say Jesus, but there was no J at the time? Jesus is, well, it was no J pronunciation, but the letter J did exist. J is I in Latin, and Yesu is the Latin name for Yeshua ben Joseph, which is Jesus, the son of Joseph, who is Jesus of Nazareth. Christ is not his name. Christ is a title applied to him by his believers. So I don't use that from a historical perspective. Who runs the Federal Reserve? I think people know who, and it's a fair criticism. Well, that's just conspiracy theories. What is your educational background? I have both a bachelor's and a master's in history. Have you seen a European colonial fort? I have. Well, not colonial, but early American. Yeah, well, it's not just wood. I know they have stones. Not just going to build it out of wood, but wood's going to be your main medium of building. Yeah, I mean, our attention spans suck. People were able to think about things in long periods of time better back in the past, I think. There wasn't always constantly being pressed out new mediums and new information. I'm not going to say which college. I don't share my personal stuff. Hard to please. And if you don't believe me, if you think I'm lying, then I'm sorry. That's a good question. Who does run the Federal Reserve? Since its beginnings until now, I'm curious. Well, Jekyll Island is where they originally came up with it. It was Woodrow Wilson's idea. It was part of the progressive movement's idea of a central banking system in order to stabilize the economy, despite the fact that the poor monetary handling caused the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, Federal Reserve Act. It is obviously hated because of Woodrow Wilson being the one who created it, and libertarians hate it because my freedoms. And of course, it's associated with very powerful people who influence world governments and economics because, of course, it's going to be associated with these very powerful people. And a lot of people want to blame the Jews or mention them or other things. I really don't care. What are your thoughts about gold and silver reaching astronomical price right now as a sign of something worse coming? I just think it's an inflation of value. I think it's also you have inflation of the currency. And so people are looking at specious cash instead of fiat currency as an alternative. It's not federal. It's federal in the sense that it handles the government's money, but it is a privately owned bank, technically speaking. What impartial historical references are there to Jesus in his story? Tacitus, who is not impartial but hostile, Pliny the Elder, who is also hostile, and Josephus, who's pretty impartial. Tell me again why you haven't touched the Kaaba. Oh, Henry, it's good to see you. Well, I haven't touched the Kaaba because the Kaaba didn't exist in the 7th century, or maybe it did, but it certainly wasn't in Mecca, because Mecca probably didn't exist in the 7th century. I respect Islam. I've done videos on Islam. I've talked about Islamic history. But of the veracity of most of early Islamic history, there's almost nothing that I can say is verifiable. And before you get your loincloths in a twist, the truth of the matter is that's true of almost every religion. It's not me bashing Islam, but it's me realizing that Jerusalem does exist. There is a Jerusalem. Jerusalem seems to have existed during the time of Christ. And so I can say, okay, Jerusalem is a historical city. And there's historical reason, based on the proportion of historical information available, there is a pretty reasonable chance that things like people like King David and Jesus of Nazareth existed. I don't see the same amount of evidence for Muhammad, who lived 6 centuries after Jesus. I just don't. Now, I do think Muhammad existed, but I don't know. But I think that the oral traditions of Islam and the written traditions of Islam don't actually corroborate Mecca. They don't corroborate Muhammad writing the Quran. And I know that in Islam, Muhammad doesn't write, he receives. It's a recitation from God. It is given from Jabriel to him in the cave. That's the first iteration, then it's given over the span of his life. But Islam, I mean, there's a lot of self-defeating historical arguments in early Islam that just don't make sense when Mecca is put in Petra in Jordan. I'm sorry, I'm just going to go there. And it's like I've criticized the Noah story because of Mount Ararat. I've criticized the veracity of many of the claims of the Bible because the history just doesn't seem to really line up with it. The birthing of Jesus is one example of that. But that doesn't mean that the religion is false. My own religious perspective is my own. What I do mean is that when I say that to Christians say, well, I disagree with you. When I say that to Muslims, I get death threats. I went to a seminar where I learned a lot about this, about the history of early Islam and how it just doesn't make a lot of sense to believe in Mecca in the 7th century in Arabia. And I literally said to myself, well, time to earn a fatwa by basically talking about this, sharing this information. And so if you look at some of my videos from the summer of last year, I was talking about this a lot. And if you look at the comments, it's basically, Hassan Abal, who was on this channel for a long time, is now gone, and other people who were on this channel and liked the channel turned on me as soon as I mentioned anything that even remotely suggested that, maybe Muhammad isn't a prophet and maybe he didn't write the Quran or even receive it. And maybe it's much more easy to believe that this is a conglomeration of thoughts and ideas that are compiled in the 7th century in Arabia, but most of the events of Muhammad's life are really, really hard to verify, including most of the things about Mecca. So yeah, ChatGPT, dude. Yes, that's literally, yes, clearly that's what ChatGPT would say. If I asked ChatGPT about the veracity of Islam, it would say, well, you're being offensive to Islam. I'm not being offensive to Islam. I love Muslims. I love a lot about Islam. I've studied a lot of Islamic history. I think it's fascinating. But I'm just not going to get into bed with every single claim from the Quran, just like I'm not going to get into bed with every single claim from Evita or from the Bible. I'm sorry. My job is to do history. And if you don't like it, then I don't know what to tell you. I don't like to say, if you don't like it, just get out, because I don't want you to leave, but at least listen. So you know what? Instead of the L word leave, the L word should be listen. If you don't like it, listen. Why do I think this? Anyways, I don't know who the powerful people are. I really just don't. I'm a Zio. Yes, I am a cuck for Israel. I get paid by AIPAC, all of this stuff. You guys are boring at this point, and you must be bored to come onto a channel that is about history and social studies, where we have over 11,000 subscribers, and just say I'm owned by the Jews. Let me see. Aliens, probably true. And a happy Ramadan to you as well. Yes. And I'm sorry that I said that during Ramadan. I forgot that it was Ramadan, but yes. Hopefully you're enjoying not eating. Then again, that's Christians are not eating either, and neither are Jews. Well, the Jews aren't fasting right now, but they fast at like Yom Kippur or something. So it's a privately owned bank, has nothing to do with the federal system, even though it's used in the name of Federal Reserve. So then I have to do some research on what owns it. Then I'm curious, given the area of the world that Jesus was born in, why does the picture of Jesus still being used look like, even if the Bible, it looks nothing like the image? Well, it's because you have European reinterpretations of that. Of course, they're going to make Jesus look a little bit more like them. What I always find interesting is if you look at Renaissance paintings, you have the patrons being put into the paintings, and most of the people around Jesus, even the apostles, are dressed like they are Europeans, but Jesus is still dressed like he's wearing robes from the 1st century. And of course, also the Shroud of Turin has a huge influence on this, because most of these people are Catholic and they believe the Shroud of Turin is a legitimate representation of Jesus' face and identity. You also have Cesare Borgia, who is an inspiration for Renaissance artwork about Jesus. So Jesus is like a psyop. Yeah, totally. Let me see. The Rothschilds are indeed Jews. Why do people believe every version of the Bible coming out like it's the truth, and the original of what they were like $60 or something, and now it's dwindled, and are they even true? Well, Bibles were a years-long salary when they first were being published in the Middle Ages, so not having the Bible was just their default, because you couldn't afford it. And even if you could, you probably couldn't read it, and even if you could read it, you couldn't understand it. So it's easier to just say the church understands the Bible. So, that's quite impossible. All these things are just made up from the Bible to the Quran, and just so people made them up for control or ease their minds. I mean, if they make them up, what are they making them up for? Was Lent always widely practiced during Christianity and during the Middle Ages? Wasn't there a pope that decided eating fish okay? Yeah, well, Catholics eat fish during Lent. Fish is the exception. It's bloody meat, so red meat, chicken, stuff like that, even though fish bleed. But basically, the 40 days of fasting of Lent represents the 40 days of Jesus in the wilderness from the New Testament. Ramadan is a month. It is a pillar of Islam. So while I'm at it, I might as well talk about it. There's 5 pillars of Islam. One of them is Salah, and that is the fasting during Ramadan and other holy days. Let me see. Ouch. That's like insulting the religion, brother. That's like telling a Christian Jesus doesn't exist. Except that Jesus does exist. The evidence is pretty sure that Jesus does exist. The evidence that Mecca existed in the 7th century doesn't exist. I'm sorry, it doesn't. Yathrib does exist.
Did Muhammad exist? Probably. The Muslim scholars who would have been absolutely stupid to invent a man who did some of the things Muhammad did. Even by Muslim standards, he died the way a false prophet died, by having his aorta punctured. Or bursting, sorry. His aorta was bursted. That's how a false prophet dies, and that's how Muhammad died. And that's according to Muslim scholars. So you would have to be pretty stupid to come up to invent a man who dies like that, who is just a complete foil and usually is constantly used as an argument to the depravity of your religion, when there's plenty of depraved people in the Old Testament and New Testament. So I think Muhammad does exist. I think the evidence is actually from silence, but it's a pretty good argument that if you were going to invent the founder of your religion, why make him so barbaric? It's a good argument. Texas is voting to ban Islam this year, at least Sharia law. Well, they can't do that. That's a violation of the Constitution. I find you pretentious and arrogant and would not consider you to be a lot of fun at a party. Have a historical day. That's going to be the pinned comment. That's the new pinned comment. Pretentious and arrogant. Well, I love how he didn't even actually say how I'm pretentious and arrogant. A lot of people compliment me on my humility or my practical speaking abilities. That I'm not going to talk down to anyone, but I mean, I guess I'll have to be a lot more pretentious or arrogant. At least I wasn't wearing the smoking jacket today. I mean, he would have gone absolutely ape if I was wearing the smoking jacket. Who were the Canaanites? The Canaanites were Semitic peoples who settled and lived in the land of Canaan. Canaan is the Levant, basically, parts of Lebanon, parts of Israel, parts of Palestine, and were Jordan as well. And were at odds often with the Jews, the Israelites, the Hebrews. The later stories seem to suggest that the Hebrews were monotheists who were sent by their God to destroy the polytheistic Canaanites. There was syncretism and shared culture between a lot of them through much of their histories, which is why the Old Testament depicts it as a bad thing, which is why they think they lose their land, the Jews lose their land. But the Canaanites were different peoples. They're not one group of Canaanites. They were just people who had settled in the land of Canaan, and this land becomes heavily contested after the Exodus story, and you have continual fights and conquests of this land. Eventually the Sea peoples get involved. This is where the Philistines come from, and these people are wiped out and subjugated, just like the Hebrews are, by the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, and later the Greeks and the Romans. Is there any historical evidence of Moses wandering around the desert for 40 years? No. There is some evidence of some sort of cataclysmic exodus from Egypt of the Hebrews, but not much more than that. What do you think about those paintings from hundreds of years ago that seem to look like there's UFOs in the sky? I have no idea. If we've been seeing UFOs, maybe the ancients saw them and didn't know how to interpret them. Do you know about the Scofield Bible and how it was introduced in the early 1900s and why it was pushed into churches under the publishing and who was behind it? No, I don't know a lot about that. The Scofield Bible is like one of those, is like the New King James Study Bible, I believe. That's an interesting observation. Where they were dressed as Italians in many of those Renaissance paintings, but Jesus is still dressed like a first century Jew. Between the collapse of the USS, let me see. I'm going to catch up to the chat and then wrap this up. May as well ask a Dead Sea Scroll question. What did the Dead Sea Scrolls prove? I talked about them earlier. The Dead Sea Scrolls showed some sort of harmonization in the level of copying and understanding and interpretation of the Old Testament scriptures by the various Jewish communities. It proved the resourcefulness and creativity of the Essene communities, particularly in Qumran, and it proved the importance of literature to the ancient Jewish peoples in Judea after they returned from the diaspora in the 6th century, after the Persians conquered the Babylonians and allowed them to return. Communities in Second Temple Judaism spring up, and one of the separatist communities is indeed the Essenes. May as well. We can't believe anything we want to the Bible, the Quran. It doesn't make it true. I mean, it doesn't make it not true, but it doesn't make it true. It's just our imagination wanting it to be true, possibly. Possibly. Between the collapse of the USSR and war on terror, things seemed pretty peaceful. Is that accurate? They were, but there were things rumbling in the background. There's an era of good feelings, an era of quiet always has rumblings. Who was the dead pope that was dug up and from the grave and put on trial? I think it was John, and it was Formosius who put him on trial. It was either that or the other way around. Texas, that would be a violation of the Constitution. Yep. Who knows? I'm not a Muslim scholar myself, so I can't answer back, but agree to disagree. I'm sorry, but it's not. You don't need to be a Muslim scholar you just need to read history, and you find out that Muslim scholarship, even if you accept the most conservative Muslim scholarship, you have to accept everything I said about Mecca and Muhammad. Do you know about Saint Expeditius? Is this a joke? I feel like this is a joke. No, Atlantis wasn't a real city. Hello, GK, great to see you. Who were the Judeans? I'm pretty sure they were Jewish people that ethnically were both named after Judah, or specifically the land of Judah. Judea was what the Romans called it before they changed the name again. All right, what do you know about St. Simon of Trent? Nothing? Anyways, I'm going to sign off. I've been going 2 hours and 25 minutes, one of the longest live streams we've ever done, but enjoyable. Well, if you're a Muslim and you're agreeing to disagree because you're a Muslim, that's fine. But, I mean, I would love to be proven wrong about this for the sake of not being threatened to be killed by Muslims, or have my mother violated by Muslims. And to be sure, there are plenty of Muslims on the channel who never did that and just said, yeah, I disagree with you, but I understand where you're coming from. It's not all Muslims, but I find that there are people who are willing to immediately turn to insulting rhetoric and then to violent threats, if they don't hear what they want to hear about Muslim history. And that is a problem. I don't have the same problem with Jews and Christians and atheists and skeptics. And I'm a theist, so I've said that I believe in a God. I just don't say which one. So that is a problem that Islam needs to fix. And if Al Chicano, if you're Muslim, I really appreciate you handling this issue maturely and responsibly, because everyone should be able to handle it. And then again, I have had Christians act stupidly on this channel before, to be sure. Thank you, Dominique. I appreciate the gift. You're not Muslim. Okay. All right, I'll read up on Simon of Trent. You have nut jobs in every religion. That's true. But the nut jobs in Christianity don't want gays to be able to marry. The nut jobs in Islam want to murder gays. That's a different category completely to me. There needs to be some sort of liberal revisionism in modern Islam. That's all I think, and I know that's not really a historical perspective, but Islam for a long time was the scientific behemoth of progress and all sorts of incredible things during the Golden Age. We need to get back to that, because Christianity has moved on from the fundamentalist days. Islam needs to too. What do you think of social networking? I think it's great. If you would follow me on Discord, we can talk more about it. How did Belgium end up in Central Africa? I thought they were landlocked. Leopold II was given it as a gift and then abused people so horribly that the entire European community threw him out on his ear, and then the land was given to the Belgians as their own colony. Women wearing makeup, go back to Cleopatra. She had tattoos put on her bodies to make her look better. Christians don't like gays either. A lot of them don't. Some of them do. But even if they don't, there's a difference between the way gays are treated in the United States, which is a predominantly Christian country historically, and the way they are treated in Iran. So that's the issue. And in the Talmud and Torah, it says crazy stuff about whether people follow it or not and everything, but it's written in the holy books. They're holy books. They're written by rabbis. Yep, that's true. There's a lot of crazy stuff in historical writings, to be sure. Helen of Troy, probably not real. Yeah. Well, having gay friends doesn't make you non-homophobic, but whatever. Anyways, I'm going to sign off. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Join us tomorrow for the live stream lecture. You can vote on the topic. This is normally the time I would usually use to start on Saturdays, but it's 6 o'clock, and I wanted to start earlier, especially for people who are international. So hopefully you all enjoyed this. If you haven't liked and subscribed, please do so. I went 2.5 hours today, half an hour longer than I intended to. So again, I appreciate it. It was fun. It was enjoyable. I'm going to sign off. Take care. Check out all the videos and content on the channel. Tomorrow is 4 p.m. Eastern. You get to hear me talk about a particular historical topic, and you get to vote on that. Have a great rest of your evening. Take care, and as always, love history. Bye-bye now. 4 p.m. Eastern. 4 p.m. Eastern. Why do I have to answer this over and over again? Wait for what? Whoa, I've been waiting for 2.5 hours to end. How much do you make from gifts? I don't know what I make from gifts. It's super chats that I make money for. Well, vote for whatever history, because I'm going to give several different topics. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.